Greetings, weary travellers of the spirit. Welcome to the sanctuary of Get Cozy Sleep. You have walked a long road today. You have carried burdens that were perhaps too heavy for your shoulders, and you have run races that seem to have no finish line. But here, the noise of the traffic fades into the gentle hum of the wind. Here, the demands of the clock dissolve into the timeless rhythm of a heartbeat. There is nothing you need to achieve in this space. There is no one you need to impress. You only need to be. If your heart feels worn by the friction of the world, like a stone in a riverbed, if you have ever felt that your best days are behind you, or that your strength is fading like the evening light, and if you find peace in the smell of damp earth, the cool touch of clay, and the quiet dignity of a solitary life, then this story is your refuge tonight. So, let the tension in your jaw loosen. Unclench your hands. Let the weight of this blanket become a shield against the worries of tomorrow. Close your eyes. Let the walls of your room melt away like mist in the morning sun. We are travelling back 2,000 years to the rugged hills of Judea, to a small village called Oakhaven, nestled between the limestone cliffs where the olive trees grow old and twisted. The air here is cool and smells of rain on dry dust. Breathe in the ancient peace. Exhale the modern chaos. The offering of scars. The sun was beginning its slow descent over the limestone ridges of Oakhaven, casting long, bruised shadows of purple and gold across the floor of the workshop. It was the hour when the light turned thick and syrupy, catching every mote of dust that danced in the air, turning the humble room into a cathedral of silence. Eldon sat before his wheel. He did not move, not yet. He simply sat there, his hands resting on his knees, breathing in the familiar scent that had defined his existence for 70 years. It was a smell composed of many layers, the mineral tang of raw earth dug from the riverbank, the damp, cellar-like coolness of the clay pit in the corner, and the faint, dry sweetness of the straw mats that lined the floor. It was the smell of creation. Eldon was old. His face was a map of the Judean wilderness, etched with deep canyons of wrinkles that ran from the corners of his eyes to the line of his jaw. His beard, once the colour of dark oak, was now as white as the wool of the sheep that grazed on the hills outside, trimmed short and neat. But it was his hands that told the true story. They were large hands, the skin stained permanently with the reddish-brown hue of the soil. The knuckles were swollen, knobbed like the roots of an ancient olive tree, enlarged by decades of wrestling form out of formlessness. They were hands that had shaped thousands of cups for thirsty children, hundreds of oil lamps for dark nights, and countless large jars for storing grain against the winter. But tonight, they trembled. A fine, involuntary tremor ran through his fingers as he lifted a cup of water to his lips. The earthenware cup rattled slightly against his teeth. Eldon closed his eyes and swallowed, feeling the cool liquid slide down his throat. He set the cup down and looked at his hands again. He did not look at them with anger, nor with pity, but with a quiet resignation. They were tired servants. They had served him well, but the winter of his strength had come. "Just one more," he whispered to the empty room. His voice was raspy, like dry leaves skittering over stone. Just one more offering. He was not speaking to a customer. There were no orders waiting on the slate by the door. The village market was full of younger potters now, men with strong backs and fast wheels who could turn out 20 bowls in the time it took Eldon to perfect one. No, this was not for the market. This was for the temple. For years, Eldon had harboured a quiet dream. He wanted to create a masterpiece, a jar of such perfect symmetry, such exquisite glaze, that it would be worthy to hold the holy water in the courts of the Lord. He wanted to pour all the skill he had gathered over a lifetime into one final vessel before his hands refused to obey him completely. He stood up, his knees popping audibly in the quiet room. He walked over to the clay pit. He had prepared the mound yesterday, covering it with a wet burlap sack to keep the moisture in. He pulled back the burlap. The clay was dark, cool, and inviting. It was terra rossa, the red earth of the valleys, enriched with iron, strong and plastic. He had spent 3 days refining it, picking out every microscopic pebble, every stray root, until the mud was as smooth as butter. Eldon sliced off a large wedge with a wire cutter. The wire sang a high, thin note as it sliced through the dense block. He carried the heavy lump of clay to his workbench to wedge it. Thump. He threw the clay down on the wooden table. Thump. He lifted it, folded it over, and threw it again. This was the rhythm of his life. Kneading the clay was essential. It removed the air bubbles. A single pocket of air trapped in the walls of a pot would expand in the heat of the kiln and shatter the vessel. The clay had to be uniform. It had to be surrendered. Eldon worked with a slow, methodical cadence. Push, fold, turn. Push, fold, turn. His breath hissed between his teeth with the effort. His shoulders burned, a dull ache that radiated down his spine. But he welcomed the pain. The pain meant he was still useful. The pain meant he was alive. Outside, the village of Oakhaven was settling down. He could hear the distant bleating of goats being herded into their pens for the night, the muffled laughter of children chasing each other home, and the rhythmic clink-clink of the blacksmith packing away his tools down the lane. But inside the workshop, there was only the sound of Eldon and the earth. When the clay was finally ready, a perfect sphere of potential, he carried it to the wheel. This was not the light, fast kick wheel of the young apprentices. This was his father's wheel, and his grandfather's before that. It was a heavy disc of solid limestone, balanced on an iron pivot. It took great strength to start, but once it was moving, it possessed a momentum that was almost unstoppable. Eldon sat on the low wooden bench. He placed the ball of clay dead centre on the wheel head. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the dusty air. He placed his bare right foot on the heavy stone flywheel beneath the table. He pushed. Grind. Whoosh. The stone resisted, heavy and stubborn. He pushed again, harder. Whoosh. Whoosh. The wheel began to turn, slowly at first, then picking up speed as Eldon fell into the rhythm. Kick, glide. Kick, glide. The heavy stone hummed a low baritone note that vibrated through the wooden bench and into Eldon's bones. It was a hypnotic sound, a lullaby of physics and motion. He dipped his hands into the water bowl. The cool water coated his skin, turning the dry roughness into something slick and fluid. He leaned forward. He engaged his core, bracing his elbows against his ribs to stabilize his shaking hands. This was the critical moment. The centering. If the clay was not perfectly centered, the pot would wobble. It would grow unevenly. It would fail. He brought his wet hands to the spinning mound. Slap, hiss. The clay met his skin. Friction and water. He pressed in with the heels of his hands, forcing the chaotic lump to submit to the centre of gravity. The clay fought back. It wobbled, pushing against his palms, trying to throw him off. It was a wrestling match between the will of the man and the will of the earth. Peace, Eldon murmured. Be still. He closed his eyes. He didn't need to see. He needed to feel. He felt the high spots, the irregularities. He applied pressure, steady and unyielding. The wheel hummed its deep song. Hum. Slowly, miraculously, the wobbling ceased. The lump of clay stopped fighting and became a perfectly still cone, spinning so true that it looked motionless, even though it was whirling beneath his hands. It was dead centre. Eldon opened his eyes. The clay glistened, wet and red under the dying light of the window. It was ready to open. It was ready to become a vessel. But Eldon did not open it yet. He pulled his hands away slowly, leaving the perfect mound spinning silently as the momentum of the stone wheel began to fade. The sun had dipped below the horizon now. The workshop was filled with the soft, blue light of twilight. Eldon wiped his hands on his apron. He was breathing hard, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool evening air. His arms trembled, exhausted from the wedging and the centering as he looked at the clay. It waited for him. It was patient. "Tomorrow," Eldon whispered to the mound. "Tomorrow we rise." He stood up, his joints protesting the movement. He walked to the window and looked out towards the east, towards where he knew the temple stood, miles away across the hills. He didn't see the gold or the marble of the great city. He only saw the first star appearing in the velvet sky, hanging there like a lantern. He felt a deep, profound solitude, but it was not a lonely feeling. It was the solitude of the watchman, the solitude of the shepherd. He was the keeper of the clay. He turned back to the room. He lit a small oil lamp, the flame sputtering to life, casting long, dancing shadows against the walls where shelves of finished pots stood like silent witnesses. He took a damp cloth and gently draped it over the clay on the wheel, tucking the edges in to keep it moist for the morning. He moved to the corner of the room, where a simple pallet of straw and wool lay. He sat down, untying his sandals. The day's labour was done. The preparation was complete. The foundation had been laid. Eldon lay down, pulling the rough wool blanket up to his chin. He listened to the wind picking up outside, rustling the leaves of the oak tree that gave the village its name. He watched the shadows flicker on the ceiling beams. His hands still throbbed with a dull ache, a reminder of his limitations. But as his eyes grew heavy, he imagined the jar that would be born tomorrow. He saw its curves, its neck, its lip. He saw it finished. He saw it whole. And in that vision, the old potter found his rest. The morning air in Oakhaven was sharp enough to cut glass. It was that precise moment before dawn when the world holds its breath, suspended between the fading dominion of the stars and the encroaching claim of the sun. Inside the workshop, the air was cold and still, smelling faintly of the damp earth Eldon had covered the night before. Eldon woke not to the crow of a rooster, but to the ache in his shoulders. It was a familiar companion, a dull, throbbing reminder of yesterday's centering. He sat up on his straw pallet, groaning softly as he rubbed the stiffness from his neck. He swung his legs over the side of the low bed, his feet finding the cold stone floor. He moved through the dim room by memory. He rekindled the small charcoal brazier in the corner, blowing gently on the embers until they glowed a sullen orange. He set a small iron pot of water on it to boil for his tea, a brew of dried mint and wild sage he'd gathered from the hillsides. While the water heated, he approached the wheel. He lifted the damp cloth he had placed over the clay the night before. The mound was there, exactly as he had left it, a perfect, silent hemisphere of red earth, centred and waiting. In the grey pre-dawn light, it looked like a sleeping planet. Eldon sat down on the bench. He wrapped his woolen cloak tighter around his chest. It was time for the opening. This was the step that frightened him the most. Centering required strength, but opening required nerve. To open the clay, one had to plunge one's thumbs into the very heart of the spinning mass, creating a void where there was once solid matter. One mistake, one twitch of a finger, and the walls would tear, the centre would shift, and the pot would be ruined. He kicked the flywheel, grind, whoosh. The stone woke from its slumber. The clay began to blur. Eldon wet his hands. The water in the bowl was icy, shocking his skin awake. He leaned over the wheel. He placed his thumbs together, hovering just above the centre point of the spinning mound. "Steady," he whispered. He pressed down. The clay resisted. It pushed back against his thumbs with the centrifugal force of the spin. Eldon held his breath. He pushed deeper, feeling the grit of the earth slide past his skin. He was drilling a well into the clay, going down, down, leaving only a quarter-inch of clay at the bottom to serve as the floor of the jar. He had to trust his fingers. He couldn't see the bottom. He had to feel the thickness of the floor through the nerves in his thumbs. If he went too deep, the bottom would crack in the kiln. If he left it too thick, the jar would be heavy and clumsy. He reached the depth. He paused. The wheel hummed. Now, He began to pull his thumbs outward, towards his palms. This was the birth of the interior. As he pulled, the solid mound blossomed open. A space was created. An emptiness. Eldon watched the void open up, dark and wet. He always found this moment profound. A jar was defined not by the clay that was there, but by the space that was not there. It was the emptiness that made it useful. It was the hollow that allowed it to hold water, or wine, or oil. Scritch. A sound broke his concentration. Eldon's hands jerked slightly, leaving a small ridge in the floor of the pot. He exhaled sharply, smoothing it out with a quick pass of his sponge. He stopped the wheel. The silence rushed back into the room, louder than before. Scritch! Meow! It came from the window ledge, a high, narrow opening that let in the northern light. Eldon squinted into the gloom. Two green eyes, luminous and unblinking, stared down at him. It was a cat, but to call it a cat was perhaps too generous. It was a spectre of a creature, a collection of sharp angles and matted grey fur stretched over a skeleton. Its ears were tattered, likely from fights with village dogs or the large ravens that scavenged the refuse piles. Eldon sighed. "I have no fish for you, little shadow. Go hunt a mouse." The cat did not move. It let out another sound, not a meow, but a raspy, pleading croak that sounded like a dry branch breaking. It was the sound of desperate hunger. Eldon looked at the creature, then back at his clay. He was a man of solitude. He did not want distractions. He needed focus for the pulling of the walls, but the eyes held him. They were not aggressive. They were merely waiting. They held the same quiet resignation he saw in his own reflection, with a grunt of annoyance that fooled no one, not even himself. Eldon stood up. He walked to the small niche in the wall where he kept his own food. He took out a small clay jug of goat's milk and a shallow chip saucer. "You're a distraction," Eldon grumbled as he poured a small amount of milk into the saucer. "I am making a holy vessel here. I do not need a beggar watching me." He walked to the window and placed the saucer on the floor, well away from the wheel. The cat didn't move immediately. It watched him with suspicion, its tail twitching nervously. Eldon returned to his bench and sat down, deliberately turning his back to the creature. He heard the soft thump of paws hitting the floor. Then the frantic, rhythmic sound of lapping. Slurp, slurp, slurp. Eldon smiled into his beard. He kicked the wheel again. The clay began to spin. He returned his hands to the open vessel. Now came the lifting. He hooked his fingers under the thick ring of clay he had opened and began to squeeze. The clay responded. It rose up between his fingers, defying gravity. A wall began to grow, rising from the spinning disc like a living thing. From the corner of his eye, he saw the cat finish the milk. It did not leave. It sat there, wrapping its tail around its bony paws, and watched him. For the first time in 20 years, the only sound in the workshop wasn't just the wheel and the man. There was the soft, rhythmic breathing of another living creature. Eldon focused on the clay wall rising under his hands. It was thin, uniform, and strong. He felt a sudden surge of warmth that had nothing to do with the charcoal fire. "Stay there then," Eldon whispered to the grey shadow in the corner. "But do not touch. This clay is for God." The cat blinked slowly, as if in agreement. Outside, the first true rays of the sun crested the hills, striking the limestone cliffs and turning the world to gold. Inside, the man and the beast sat in the quiet dust, witnessing the slow, spiralling ascent of the jar. The sun had climbed higher, piercing the clerestory window with a shaft of light that was no longer gold, but a blinding, dusty white. The air in the workshop had warmed, carrying the dry heat of the Judean mid-morning, baking the smell of the wet clay into something earthy and primitive. Eldon wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his forearm, leaving a streak of reddish mud across his forehead like a warrior's paint. On the wheel, the clay was no longer a mound. It was a thick, low ring, open and waiting. Now began the battle against gravity. Now began the pull. Eldon dipped his hands into the water bowl again. The water was muddy now, thick with slip, the liquid silk of dissolved clay. He rubbed his hands together, coating them in the lubricant. Without the slip, his skin would drag against the spinning earth, twisting the walls and tearing the vessel apart. Friction was the enemy here. Fluidity was the key. He leaned in. The cat, Shadow, had finished his milk and was now sitting on a pile of empty burlap sacks in the corner, washing a paw with methodical indifference. The creature had accepted the space, if not the man. "Watch closely," Eldon murmured, his voice barely audible over the hum of the stone wheel. "This is how we rise." He positioned his hands. His left hand slid inside the opening, pressing against the inner wall. His right hand cupped the outside. His knuckles bent into a rigid claw. The clay wall was sandwiched between them. He kicked the flywheel. Thud, whoosh. Thud, whoosh. The rhythm was faster now. The clay needed speed to defy its own weight. Eldon squeezed. He felt the clay respond instantly. It was plastic, eager, and alive. He applied pressure from the outside with his knuckle, pushing the clay inward while his inside fingers supported it. And then he began to lift. Slowly. If he moved his hands too fast, he would spiral the clay right off the rim. If he moved too slow, the wall would become too thin in one spot and collapse. He had to move in perfect synchronization with the rotation of the wheel. One rotation, 1 inch of rise. The clay grew. It was a magical sight, even after 50 years. The thick ring of red earth stretched upward, defying the pull of the earth beneath it. It transformed from a squat bowl into a cylinder, rising 3 inches, 5 inches, 8 inches. Eldon's breath hitched. A sharp pain shot through his lower back, a spasm of the old muscles protesting the tension. His right hand wavered, just a fraction of an inch. The rim of the cylinder wobbled. The centrifugal force seized the imperfection, threatening to widen the wobble until the whole piece tore itself apart. "No," Eldon hissed. He didn't panic. Panic was for apprentices. He held his breath, locking his core muscles, forcing his trembling arm to become stone. He didn't try to force the clay back. He simply held his position, becoming a steady anchor that the clay had to pass through. The clay hit his steady finger. Once, twice, 3 times. And then it aligned. The wobble vanished. The wall returned to true. Eldon exhaled, a long, shuddering breath. He slowly released the pressure and drew his hands up and away. The cylinder stood before him, tall and straight, like the trunk of a young cedar tree. It was not yet a jar. It had no belly, no neck, no lip. It was simply potential, stretched to its limit. Eldon sat back, his chest heaving slightly. He looked at the cat. Shadow had stopped washing and was watching the spinning tower with wide, dilated pupils, mesmerized by the motion. "You see?" Eldon said, reaching for a small wooden rib, a smooth, flat tool made from olive wood. "The clay remembers. If you touch it with fear, it wobbles. If you touch it with peace, it stands." He realized he was talking to the cat as if it were Sarah. The thought brought a sudden, sharp pang of absence. Sarah used to sit on that very stool in the corner, shelling almonds or mending tunics while he worked. She would hum old psalms, her voice weaving in and out of the sound of the wheel. She had been the one to glaze the pots in the early years, her hands steadier than his ever were. Since she had passed, 3 winters ago, the silence in the workshop had been heavy, a physical weight that pressed against his eardrums. He had filled the silence with work, with the grinding of the stone, with the slapping of mud. But the silence always came back. Now, strangely, the presence of the scrawny, flea-bitten cat made the silence less oppressive. It was a living silence. Eldon turned back to the wheel. The cylinder was tall enough now, perhaps 18 inches. But the walls were still thick at the bottom. He needed one more pull to thin them out, to give the jar the lightness it required. This was the dangerous pull. The walls were already high, The clay was tired. It had been stretched and stressed. It wanted to slump. It wanted to lie down. "Courage," Eldon whispered. He re-wet the walls. He engaged the wheel again. He reached down to the very base of the cylinder. He dug his outside knuckle into the clay, finding the reservoir of thickness hidden there. He began to drag it upward. The wall thinned. It rose higher, growing taller than his elbows. It was becoming a column of red glass, fragile and swaying slightly with the rotation. Eldon's eyes were locked on the rim. He could feel the grain of the grog sand in the clay moving under his fingertips. He was entirely in the present moment. There was no past, no Sarah, no temple, no rejection. There was only the sensation of wet earth moving against skin. He reached the top. He held the rim for a second to compress it, making it strong. Then he let go. The cylinder stood nearly 2 feet tall. It was a majestic tube of wet earth, glistening in the sun shaft. The walls were dangerously thin, uniform and taut as a drum skin. Eldon grabbed a piece of wire and ran it under the base to cut it free from the wheel head, though he would not move it yet. He picked up a damp sponge on a stick to mop out the water that had pooled in the bottom of the jar. "It is good," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He looked at his hands. They were coated in red slip, shaking violently now that the work was paused. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind the exhaustion of the old. But looking at the tall, proud cylinder, he felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. He had raised the earth. He had taken the dust to the ground and made it stand up. "Now," Eldon said to the cat, who'd curled into a ball and closed its eyes, unimpressed by the architectural feat. "Now we give it a soul. Now we give it a shape." But that would be for the afternoon. The clay needed to stiffen slightly, to catch its breath, before he could push it out into the swelling curve of the water jar. If he pushed now, it would collapse. Patience was as much a tool as the wheel itself. Eldon stood up, wiping his hands on his apron. He walked to the door of the workshop and stepped out into the blinding brightness of the day. He needed to stretch his back. He needed to feel the sun. He looked down the dusty road leading toward the village well. He saw women walking with jars on their heads, jars he had likely made years ago. They were sturdy, functional things. But the one sitting on his wheel, that was different. That was a prayer made solid. He turned back inside, glancing at the sleeping cat and the rising tower of clay. For the first time in years, the workshop didn't feel like a place of ending. It felt like a place of beginning. The afternoon light in the workshop had shifted, turning from the harsh white of noon to a mellow, golden amber. The dust motes dancing in the sunbeams seemed to slow down, suspended in the thick, warm air. Eldon sat before the wheel again. The cylinder he'd thrown in the morning stood waiting. It had stiffened slightly in the dry air, losing its wet sheen and taking on a dull, matte texture. It was no longer sloppy mud, it was leather hard, possessing a firm, yielding resistance. It was time for the shaping. This was the part of the craft Eldon loved most, and feared most. To make a cylinder was engineering. To make a jar was poetry. A cylinder was a pipe. A jar was a body. It had a foot, a belly, a shoulder, a neck, and a lip. It mimicked the human form because, like a human, its purpose was to contain life. "Now," Eldon whispered, dipping his hands into the water bowl. "Now we give you room to breathe." He kicked the wheel gently. Grind. Hum. He did not need speed now. He needed torque. He needed a slow, powerful rotation that would allow him to stretch the clay without tearing it. He reached for his favourite tool, a rib made from the heartwood of an olive tree, polished smooth by his grandfather's hands, and then by his father's, and now by his own. It was shaped like a kidney bean, curved and hard. He slid his left hand deep inside the tall cylinder. The clay felt cool and dark against his skin. He could feel the moisture trapped within the walls. He placed the wooden rib against the outside of the cylinder with his right hand. He began to push. From the inside, his fingers pressed outward against the spinning wall. From the outside, the rib supported the clay, smoothing it as it expanded. This was an act of faith. He was thinning the walls further, stretching the material to its absolute limit. He was asking the clay to balloon outward, to defy gravity, to hold a shape that was wider than its base. Watch. The straight vertical lines of the cylinder began to soften. A curve appeared, gentle at first, then growing more pronounced. The clay blossomed. It swelled outward like a sail catching the wind. Eldon closed his eyes, visualizing the shape in his mind. He wasn't looking at the pot. He was feeling the curve through the wooden rib. He could feel the tension in the clay, the way the particles aligned and stretched. It was a sensation of immense vulnerability. If he pushed too hard, the wall would collapse. If he didn't push enough, the jar would look stiff and lifeless. Breathe, he coached the clay. Feel yourself. The belly of the jar grew rounder. It was becoming voluptuous, a full, satisfying sphere that promised abundance. But as the belly grew, the walls grew thinner. Suddenly, a spasm seized Eldon's left forearm, the arm inside the jar. It was a sharp, biting cramp, a rebellion of his aging muscles against the sustained tension. His hand jerked. Inside the jar, his fingers dug into the soft wall. No. The wheel spun on. A ripple of distortion shuddered through the wet clay. The perfect curve of the belly developed a lump, a bruise where his faltering strength had betrayed him. The jar wobbled, threatening to slump into a shapeless pile of mud. Eldon froze. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. Panic rose in his throat, the bitter taste of failure. "I'm too old," the voice in his head whispered. "My hands are too weak for this glory." But he did not pull his hands away. To withdraw now would be to admit defeat. The wobble would amplify, and the pot would be lost. He forced himself to breathe. Long, slow, deep exhalations. He channeled the breath down his arm, past the cramping elbow, into his fingertips. He softened his touch. He didn't try to fight the wobble with force, he met it with gentleness. He pressed the olive wood rib firmly against the outside bruise and supporting the weak spot. He waited. 1 rotation. 2 rotations. 10. The clay, forgiving and plastic, accepted the correction. The lump smoothed out. The ripple vanished. The wobble settled into a true spin. Eldon opened his eyes. Sweat stung the corners of his vision. The jar was still standing. It was wider now, magnificent in its fullness. He withdrew his left hand slowly. It was covered in red slip, shaking violently as the cramp finally released its hold. He rested it on his knee, massaging the knot of muscle. "You are stubborn," he said to his hand. Then he looked at the jar. "And you are gracious." He looked over at the corner. Shadow. The cat was awake. The creature was sitting upright, its tail wrapped neatly around its paws, staring at the wheel with an intensity that bordered on reverence. The cat's ears swiveled towards him, twitching at the sound of his voice. "Did you see that?" Eldon asked the cat. "We almost lost it." The cat blinked slowly, a gesture of calm in the dusty silence. Eldon dipped the rib into the water again. Now came the closing. He had pushed the belly out, now he had to bring the neck in. This was called collaring. He placed both hands around the top of the swollen form, encircling the clay like a lover's embrace. He squeezed gently, lifting upward and inward. The wide opening began to narrow. The shoulder of the jar formed, a strong, sloping arch that transitioned from the wide belly to the slender neck. This required compression. The clay had to be thickened here to support the rim. The neck rose, elegant and proud. Finally, the rim. Eldon took a small strip of chamois leather, wet and soft. He draped it over the spinning lip of the jar. He applied gentle pressure. The rough edge of the clay smoothed out. becoming rounded and perfect. It was a lip meant for pouring, a lip meant for offering. Eldon took his foot off the flywheel. The momentum carried the wheel for a few more rotations, slower and slower, until it came to a halt. Silence returned to the workshop, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was the silence of completion. Eldon stepped back. He wiped his hands on his apron and simply looked. The jar was magnificent. It stood nearly 2 feet tall, its proportions classical and harmonious. The belly was full and round, capable of holding 5 gallons of water. The neck was slender, flaring gracefully at the rim. The red clay glowed with a deep, inner warmth in the afternoon sun. It was the finest thing he had ever made. He felt a lump form in his own throat, matching the fullness of the jar. He had done it. Despite the tremor, despite the age, despite the fear, "It is finished," he whispered. He didn't touch it. It was too soft, too new. He picked up the cutting wire, a twisted copper strand with wooden toggles at each end. He pulled it taut between his hands. He slid the wire under the base of the jar, slicing through the clay that attached it to the wheel head. Zip. The sound was clean and final. The jar was now an independent object, separated from the machine that made it. Eldon walked to the window. The sun was low now, painting the hills of Judea in shades of violet and burnt orange. "Tomorrow," he said to the room, "we carve. We dress you in vines and leaves." He poured the remaining milk from his own cup into the cat's saucer. Shadow trotted over, the sound of his paws soft on the stone floor. Eldon sat on his stool, watching the light fade from the curves of the wet jar. He felt a profound exhaustion, deep in his marrow, but it was a sweet exhaustion. It was the feeling of a field that has been ploughed and sown. He looked at the jar one last time before the darkness took the room. In the dim light, the vessel seemed to be breathing, expanding and contracting with the shadows. It was waiting for the fire. And Eldon knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that the fire would test everything. The next day, the clay had changed. It had passed through the night silence and arrived at a state potter's call leather hard. It was no longer the wet, slump-prone mud of yesterday. It had stiffened, holding its shape with a firm, cool dignity. It felt like a block of cheddar cheese or a piece of polished wood, yielding to the fingernail, yet strong enough to be carved. Eldon ran his hand down the flank of the jar. It was cold to the touch, retaining the moisture in its pores like a secret. The surface was smooth, a matte russet brown that absorbed the morning light rather than reflecting it. "You are ready," Eldon murmured. Today was not for the wheel. Today was for the knife. He picked up his stylus. It was a simple tool, a slender rod of iron set into a handle of staghorn, the metal tip worn bright and silver by years of friction against the earth. It was sharp enough to slice, but dull enough not to snag. He pulled his wooden stool closer to the jar. He did not sit at the wheel today. He sat beside the drying shelf where the jar rested on a wooden bat. Shadow, the cat, had already taken up his post. He sat on the corner of the workbench, his tail twitching rhythmically, watching Eldon's hand with the intense predatory focus of a supervisor. Eldon rested his left hand gently on the neck of the jar to steady it. With his right hand, he brought the iron stylus to the shoulder of the vessel. He paused. This was the moment of decision. In Jerusalem, the wealthy merchants preferred jars embossed with elaborate lilies, or pomegranates bursting with seeds, or complex geometric patterns borrowed from the Greeks. They wanted their vessels to scream of abundance and skill. But this jar was not for a merchant's table. It was for the temple. And before the temple, it was for the God who made the wilderness. Eldon closed his eyes and remembered the River Jordan. He remembered how the water looked in the early morning, not the rushing rapids, but the quiet eddies near the reeds where the flow turned back on itself in gentle, concentric circles. He remembered the humility of the water, how it always sought the lowest place, yet sustained all life in the valley. Simplicity. Eldon whispered. Truth. He opened his eyes and pressed the iron tip into the clay. The sound was satisfying, a soft, dry whisper of metal parting earth. A thin ribbon of clay curled away from the stylus, falling to the floor like a paring from an apple. Eldon began to carve. He did not measure. He did not sketch with charcoal first. He let the memory of the river guide his hand. He started at the shoulder, just below the neck. He cut a single undulating line that wrapped around the circumference of the jar. It was the surface of the water. Below that, he carved another line, echoing the first but slightly different, like a shadow of a wave. The work was slow. It was a meditation. Cut, lift, blow the dust away. Cut. As the ribbons of clay fell to the workbench, Shadow could no longer contain himself. The cat reached out a tentative paw and batted at a long, curling strip of leather-hard clay. It crumbled. Shadow looked offended, then batted at another one. Eldon chuckled. The sound was rusty in his throat, unused to laughter. "It is not a mouse, little one," Eldon said, not stopping his work. "It is just the skin of the earth." Shadow ignored him, pouncing on a falling scrap with ferocious agility, scattering red crumbs across the table. Eldon didn't shoo him away. The playfulness of the creature lightened the solemnity of the task. It reminded Eldon that while God was holy, he also made the kitten that chases the dust. Eldon returned to the jar. He moved lower, to the belly. Here, he decided to carve a vine. Not the heavy, fruit-laden vines of the royal vineyards. No, he carved the wild grape, the hardy, twisting vines that grew in the rocky crevices of the hill country. The vines that survived the drought. He pressed the stylus deeper. He carved the gnarled texture of the wood, the twists and turns of the branches. He carved leaves that were not perfect, but windblown, their edges slightly curled. He worked in a trance. The sun moved across the sky, shifting the shadows in the room, but Eldon didn't notice. He was lost in the geography of the jar. He was carving his own life into the clay, the twisted paths, the dry seasons, the enduring roots. As he worked, he thought of the high priest who might one day hold this jar. Would he feel the texture of these vines? Would he understand that the clay was speaking of resilience? Or would he only see a container for water? It does not matter, Eldon thought. The water will know. He reached the bottom of the jar. He carved the roots disappearing into the base, grounding the vessel. He set the stylus down. He blew gently on the surface of the jar, clearing away the last of the clay crumbs. He stepped back. The decoration was subtle. From a distance, the jar looked almost plain, but up close, the light caught the edges of the incisions, creating a landscape of shadows and highlights. The vines seemed to be growing out of the pot, wrapping around it in a protective embrace. The river lines at the top shimmered like a halo. It was not a display of technical dominance. It was a confession of faith. "It is done," Eldon said, his voice soft. He looked at his hands. They were stiff, cramping from the hours of precise gripping. He rubbed his knuckles. Shadow had fallen asleep amidst the carnage of the clay scraps, his grey fur dusted with red powder. He looked like a statue found in a ruin. Eldon carefully picked up the wooden bat on which the jar sat. This was the most dangerous time. The jar was greenware now, unfired clay. It was at its most fragile state. A bump, a sudden shock, or drying too fast could crack it. He carried it to the slowest drying shelf, away from the direct draft of the window. He draped a thin, dry cloth over it loosely, to slow the evaporation. "Rest now," he told the jar. "The fire comes later." He walked back to the workbench. He swept the clay trimmings into a bucket to be recycled. Nothing was wasted in the potter's house. The scraps would be soaked, wedged, and become a cup or a bowl next month. Eldon sat down on his pallet. The day was waning. The golden hour had passed into the blue bruised twilight. He felt a deep, resonant peace. The jar was formed. The jar was dressed. It was out of his hands now. could do nothing more until the moisture had fully left the clay. He looked at the sleeping cat. He looked at the shrouded shape of the jar in the shadows. "We are a strange family," he whispered to the silence. "An old man, a stray cat, and a pot of dirt." But as he lay down, pulling the wool blanket up to his chin, he felt less like a lonely old man and more like a guardian. He was guarding a treasure. Outside, the first stars appeared over Oakhaven. The wind whispered through the olive trees, sounding very much like the stylus carving the clay, a soft, continuous shh that promised that even in the dark, the work of creation continues. Eldon closed his eyes, and in his dreams, the vine on the jar began to grow, turning green and alive, reaching up towards the sky. 3 days passed. 3 days of dry wind and waiting. The jar sat on the shelf, changing colour as the moisture left its body. It turned from the deep, dark russet of the riverbank to a pale, dusty pink, the colour of a dried bone. It was bone dry now. It was at its most fragile state. A harsh word seemed enough to shatter it. But tonight, the waiting ended. Tonight was the fire. The kiln stood in the courtyard behind the workshop like a dormant beast. It was a beehive-shaped structure built of blackened bricks and mud, scarred by 1,000 fires of the past. It smelled perpetually of ash and soot, a sharp, acrid scent that hung in the air even when the fire was cold. The sun had set, leaving a bruised purple sky over Oakhaven. The air was cooling rapidly, but Eldon was sweating. He had spent the last hour loading the kiln. It was a delicate surgery. He had placed the great jar in the very centre of the firing chamber, the place of honour, but also the place of greatest peril. Around it he had stacked wasters, older, imperfect pots that would serve as shields, protecting the masterpiece from the direct lick of the flames. "You're surrounded," Eldon whispered into the dark mouth of the kiln before he sealed it. "You are safe." He began to brick up the door. Clink, scrape, mud mortar and heavy brick. He left only the small spy holes open, peering eyes through which he would judge the heat. Shadow, the cat, sat on the woodpile, his green eyes reflecting the last light of the day. He seemed to understand that the atmosphere had shifted. The playful mood of the carving day was gone. This was serious business. This was elemental. Eldon knelt before the firebox at the base of the kiln. He struck the flint. A spark jumped, landing in the nest of dry grass. A small, yellow flame curled upward. "Grow," Eldon commanded softly. He fed it kindling, twigs of rosemary and thyme that crackled and popped, releasing a pungent herbal incense. Then came the smaller branches of olive wood. The fire took hold. A low growl began deep in the throat of the kiln. This was the candling period. It had to be slow, gentle. If the heat rose too fast, the remaining microscopic water deep within the clay walls would turn to steam. Steam expands. If it expanded inside the clay, the jar would explode. Eldon sat on a log, watching the fire. He would not sleep tonight. A potter does not sleep when the kiln is awake. Hours ticked by. The stars wheeled overhead in their silent, cosmic dance. The fire grew hungry. Eldon fed it oak logs now. The growl turned into a roar. Whoosh. Crackle. Roar. The draft pulled the flame upward, wrapping around the pots inside, searching for the chimney at the top. The heat radiated outward, pushing back the night's chill. Shadow moved closer, drawn by the warmth, curling up near Eldon's boots, purring in time with the fire's rumble. Eldon stared into the flames, and as the heat blurred the air, the years began to peel away. The smell of burning oak. It was the smell of his life. It was the perfume of his marriage. He remembered Sarah. On nights like this, 40 years ago, she would not sleep either. She would come out with a basket of bread and figs. She would sit beside him, her shoulder touching his. They wouldn't speak much. The roar of the fire made speech difficult. They would just watch the sparks fly up into the Milky Way. "It's a good draught tonight," she would say. "Aye," he would answer. "The wind is with us." He remembered the way the firelight played on her face, softening the lines, making her eyes look like deep pools of oil. She was the one who taught him that the fire doesn't just harden the clay, it purifies it. The fire burns away what isn't true, she used to say. Eldon wiped his eye with a soot-stained knuckle. The smoke, he told himself. It was just the smoke. He stood up. The kiln needed more. He looked through the spy hole. Inside. It was a terrifying world. The pots were no longer pink. They were glowing a dull, angry red. The air inside was shimmering. Visible turbulence. "Hotter," Eldon whispered. He threw in more wood. The kiln gulped it down. The temperature climbed. Red heat turned to orange. Orange turned to yellow. This was the critical threshold. The clay was beginning to vitrify. The silica particles were melting, fusing together, transforming from fragile earth into stone. It was a chemical miracle happening in the dark. Eldon paced. His shadow stretched long and dancing against the workshop wall. He was the priest of this ritual, attending to the altar of heat. He checked the spy hole again. White heat. It was blinding. The jar was there, in the centre. It was glowing so brightly it was almost transparent, like a ghost of itself. It looked as though it was about to melt into a puddle of glass. "Hold on," Eldon urged. "Do not collapse. Stand." He could feel the tension in the structure of the jar. The particles were screaming, shifting, locking into their eternal positions. The vine he had carved was being seared into permanence. This was the violence of creation. There is no beauty without the fire. Shadow stood up, his fur bristling. The heat was too intense now even for him. He retreated to the shadows, hissing softly at the roaring monster. Eldon was drenched in sweat. His tunic stuck to his back. His face felt scorched. But he did not look away. He had to judge the colour. He had no thermometer, only the ancient knowledge of his eyes. It is time, he decided. The colour was a perfect, blinding straw yellow. The glaze would be melting, flowing like honey over the vines. Eldon stopped feeding the wood. He picked up a large flat stone and sealed the firebox. He climbed up and placed a heavy brick over the chimney flue. He choked the beast. The roar subsided instantly, replaced by a muffled, suffocating silence. The fire was trapped inside, forced to soak into the pots, to finish its work in the quiet dark. Eldon slumped back onto the log. His legs were shaking. It was done. Now began the cooling. This was often harder than the firing. If it cooled too fast, the thermal shock would crack the pots. They had to cool slowly, at the same rhythm they heated. Eldon sat in the sudden quiet. The kiln ticked and pinged as the bricks contracted, the sound of cooling metal and stone. Tink. Tink. He reached down and stroked the cat's head. Shadow leaned into his hand, a solid, living warmth against the fading heat of the fire. "We have done all we can, Shadow," Eldon whispered. "It is out of our hands now." He looked up at the sky. The moon had moved across the heavens. Morning was not far off. Eldon felt a strange emptiness. For weeks, his life had been defined by the making of this jar. Digging, wedging, throwing, carving. Now, the making was over. The jar existed, or it didn't. It was either a masterpiece or a pile of shards inside that brick tomb. He wouldn't know for 2 days. The kiln had to sleep. Eldon leaned his head back against the wood pile. The exhaustion hit him like a physical blow. He closed his eyes. The image of the white-hot jar still burned into his retinas. In the darkness, he prayed. Not for the jar. Strangely, he prayed for himself. He prayed that he, too, could withstand the fire. He prayed that when his own time came to be tested, he would not crack. "Make me like the clay," he mumbled, drifting into a fitful doze. "Burn away what isn't true." The fire inside the kiln glowed on, unseen, doing its secret work in the heart of the night. 2 days. To a child, 2 days is an eternity. To To a mountain, it is less than a blink. But to a potter waiting for a kiln to cool, 2 days is a unique form of purgatory. The workshop had been silent. Eldon had moved through the hours like a ghost, sweeping the floor, mixing new clay, feeding the cat, but his mind was entirely outside, trapped behind the bricked-up door of the oven. He had checked the kiln wall every few hours, placing his palm against the rough masonry. At first, it had been too hot to touch. By the second morning, it was the warmth of a fresh loaf of bread. By the evening of the second day, it was the gentle warmth of a living body. Now, on the morning of the third day, it was time. The sun had just cleared the eastern ridge, throwing long, sharp shadows across the courtyard. The air was crisp, smelling of dew and cypress. Eldon stood before the kiln. Shadow sat on the perimeter wall, tail twitching, sensing the anticipation. "Oh, open," Eldon whispered. He picked up his chisel and a heavy wooden mallet. He didn't attack the door, he dismantled it with reverence. Clink, crack. He chipped away the dried mud mortar holding the top brick. It crumbled into dust. He wiggled the brick loose and pulled it out. A puff of warm air escaped from the dark hole, a breath from the underworld. It carried the scent of roasted earth and minerals, a dry, clean smell that was older than history. Eldon peered into the hole. It was dark inside, and he could see nothing but shapes. He continued, brick by brick. The wall came down. Thud, thud, thud. As the opening grew larger, the light flooded in. First, he saw the wasters, the sacrificial pots he had placed around the perimeter. They were scorched, some cracked, bearing the brunt of the flame's fury. They had done their duty. Eldon moved them aside gently, stacking them on the grass. Even the broken soldiers deserved respect. And then, the centre was revealed. Eldon stopped breathing. There, sitting on the kiln shelf, untouched by the ash, stood the jar. It was no longer the colour of dried bone. It had been transformed. The glaze had melted and fused with the clay, turning a deep, translucent teal, the colour of the Mediterranean Sea where it deepens beyond the shelf. But it wasn't a flat colour. It was alive. The heat had caused the copper in the glaze to dance with the iron in the clay, creating a landscape of hues. Where the vines were carved, the glaze had pooled thicker, turning a dark, mysterious emerald green. On the ridges of the leaves, the glaze had thinned, revealing the warm, toasted orange of the earth beneath. It looked as if the vine was glowing from within. Eldon reached in. He hesitated. His hand, shaking slightly with age and awe, hovered inches from the surface. He was afraid to touch it. It looked wet, fluid, as if it was still molten glass. But he knew it was stone hard. He touched the rim. It was cool now, smooth, impossible smoothness. It felt like touching a polished gemstone, not a thing made of mud. He gripped the neck and the base. He lifted it out. It was lighter than he expected. That was the mark of a master, to make a vessel that looked substantial but felt like air. He carried it out into the full sunlight of the courtyard. "Oh," he exhaled, a sound that was half laugh, half sob. The sunlight hit the surface, and the jar seemed to ignite. The crackle effect, a network of microscopic fissures in the glaze, caught the light, shimmering like a spiderweb covered in morning dew. It wasn't a flaw, it was a texture that gave the surface depth, making it look ancient and eternal. Shadow hopped down from the wall and trotted over, sniffing at the strange object that smelled of fire. "Look, Shadow," Eldon whispered, his voice trembling. "Look what the fire gave us." He set the jar down on the rustic wooden table in the centre of the yard. He walked around it. He inspected it from every angle. It was perfect. There was no warp in the rim. It was a perfect circle. There was no crack in the base. It sat solid and true without rocking. The vines flowed seamlessly around the belly, an endless loop of growth. Eldon felt a strange sensation in his chest. It was pride. Yes, but it was mixed with a sudden, overwhelming humility. How could his hands, These gnarled, shaking, arthritic tools have made this. It felt as though he hadn't made it at all. It felt as though he had simply uncovered it, as if the jar had always existed inside the clay, and he had merely stripped away the excess earth to set it free. Ping! A high, clear note rang out in the quiet morning air. Eldon froze. It was the sound of the glaze contracting as it adjusted to the cool air, the song of the kiln. It was a musical note, pure and bell-like. Ping! Another note, slightly lower. The jar was singing. Eldon sat down on the bench, his legs suddenly weak. He stared at the vessel. It was the culmination of 50 years of labour. Every mistake he had ever made, every pot that had collapsed, every kiln that had misfired, they were all lessons leading to this single object. This is it, he thought. I will never make anything better than this. The thought was bittersweet. It was the summit of the mountain. From here, there was only the descent. He imagined the jar in the temple. He saw it placed on a table of acacia wood overlaid with gold. He saw the high priest in his ephod, lifting a silver ladle to draw water from this teal vessel. He saw the light of the menorah reflecting in its glossy surface. It belonged there. It was too beautiful for Oakhaven. It was too beautiful for his dusty workshop. It was a holy thing. I must protect it, Eldon said aloud. The protective instinct surged in him, fierce and sudden. He stood up and picked up the jar again, clutching it to his chest as if it were a child. He carried it back inside the workshop. The room felt dark and dingy compared to the brilliance of the jar. The dust on the floor, the cobwebs in the rafters, the pile of old sacks. Suddenly, everything looked unworthy. He looked for a place to put it. The workbench was too cluttered. The floor was too dirty. He looked at the high shelf near the window, the pedestal. It was a sturdy shelf of oak, high enough to be out of reach of clumsy elbows, but low enough to catch the light from the clerestory window. He carefully cleared the shelf. He wiped it with a clean cloth until the wood shone. He placed the jar there. It sat in the beam of light, regal and solitary. It dominated the room. It demanded silence. Eldon stepped back. He wiped his hands on his apron, though they were clean. He felt a sudden distance from the object. Yesterday, it was clay he could mould. Today, it was a masterpiece he could only serve. Shadow wandered in, looking for breakfast. The cat glanced up at the shelf, unimpressed by the shiny object that offered no milk and no warmth. "Do not go near that," Eldon warned the cat, his voice sharper than usual. Shadow paused, ears flicking back, sensing the change in the old man's tone. The easy camaraderie of the last week evaporated slightly. Eldon was no longer just the provider of milk. He was now the guard of the treasure. Eldon went to his cupboard and took out a small piece of dried fish for the cat. But he didn't sit down to watch him eat. He went back to the shelf. He stood there, arms crossed, guarding his creation. He didn't know it yet, but the perfection of the jar had introduced a new element into the workshop. Fear. Before, if a pot broke, it was just mud. Now, there was something to lose. And the fear of losing it was already beginning to cast a shadow over his joy. The jar gleamed in the silence. Beautiful, cold, and terribly fragile. The night came down like a heavy curtain, sealing Oakhaven in a darkness that felt thicker than usual. Inside the workshop, the air was tense. It was the eve of the pilgrimage. Tomorrow, before the sun crested the ridge, Eldon would wrap the teal jar in layers of wool and straw, strap it to his back, and begin the long walk to Jerusalem. But tonight, the jar sat on the high shelf, gleaming under the fitful light of the oil lamp. Eldon could not sleep. He paced the small room. 3 steps to the wheel, turn. 3 steps to the door, turn. His shadow stretched and shrank against the walls, a restless spirit trapped in a bottle. He found himself checking the jar every few minutes. Was the shelf steady? Was the window shutter latched tight? Was there a draught? The object had ceased to be a vessel. It had become a presence. It demanded his attention. It sucked the oxygen out of the room. "It is safe," he muttered to himself, running a hand through his thinning white hair. "It is just clay. It is just a pot." But he knew he was lying. It was not just a pot. It was his vindication. It was the proof that his life had meant something. When the priests saw this, when they saw the way the glaze broke over the vines, the way the form held the light, they would know that Eldon of Oakhaven was not just a village scratcher. They would know he was an artist. Pride. It was a cold, metallic taste in his mouth. He tried to swallow it down, reminding himself that this was an offering to the Almighty. But in the reflection of the jar's glossy surface, he didn't see the face of God. He saw his own distorted reflection, small and anxious. Thump. Eldon spun around, his heart hammering. It was just shadow. The cat had jumped down from the rafters onto the workbench. "Easy," Eldon breathed, his hand clutching his chest. The cat stretched, arching his back, and looked at Eldon with wide, innocent eyes. Shadow let out a soft "m", a sound of greeting, a request for connection. He trotted towards Eldon, weaving between the drying bowls, his tail held high. He approached the high shelf where the jar sat. "No," Eldon snapped. The word was too loud, too harsh for the small room. Shadow froze. One paw lifted in midair. He looked at Eldon, confused. This was the man who had shared his milk. This was the man who had let him play with the clay scraps. "Get away from there," Eldon hissed, advancing on the cat. "You're clumsy. You're dirty. You'll knock it over." He waved his arms. Shadow flinched. The cat flattened his ears, hissing softly, not in aggression, but in fear. He scrambled backward, his claws skittering on the wooden workbench, knocking over a small cup of water. Splash. The water spilled across the table, dripping onto the floor. "See?" Eldon cried, pointing a shaking finger. "You are a menace! Out! Get out!" He grabbed a broom from the corner, and he didn't hit the cat, but he swept the air aggressively, driving the creature towards the door. Shadow didn't understand the sudden change in the rules. He only knew that the sanctuary was no longer safe. With a flash of grey fur, he bolted through the open door and into the night. Eldon slammed the heavy wooden door shut. He threw the bolt. Thud. Silence returned. Eldon stood there, breathing hard. The broom still clutched in his hand. He looked at the puddle of water on the workbench. He looked at the empty space where the cat usually slept. A pang of guilt pricked him, sharp and sudden. He had chosen the pot over the living thing. It is necessary. He justified himself to the empty room. The jar is holy. The cat is just a beast. I cannot risk it. He turned back to the shelf. The jar sat there, impassive, beautiful, and cold. It offered no comfort. It simply shone. Outside, the wind began to pick up. It was a dry, desert wind whistling through the cracks in the stone walls. The olive tree outside scratched its branches against the roof tiles. Scritch, scratch, like fingernails trying to pry the house open. Eldon moved his pallet. He dragged the straw mattress from the corner and placed it directly underneath the high shelf. He would sleep here, like a guard dog at the foot of his master. He lay down, but he did not extinguish the lamp. He couldn't bear to let the jar disappear into the darkness. He stared up at the teal curve of the vessel. The lamplight danced on its belly, making the vines look as if they were writhe. "Tomorrow," Eldon whispered. "Tomorrow you go to God, and I will be free of this worry." He closed his eyes, but sleep was thin and brittle. Every creak of the rafters made him jump. Every gust of wind made him tense. He dreamt of the jar. In his dream, the jar grew larger and larger until it filled the whole room, pressing him against the wall. He tried to scream, but his mouth was full of dry clay. Outside, the wind howled louder, rattling the old shutters. And somewhere in the darkness, a rejected creature sought shelter from the coming storm, circling the house, looking for a way back in. The wind did not merely blow, it besieged. It began as a low whistle through the chinks in the stonemasonry, a warning note played on a hollow reed. But within the hour, it had swelled into a full-throated roar, a cacophony of air that battered against the wooden shutters and tore at the thatched eaves of the village roofs. Then came the rain. It was not the gentle, nurturing shower of the spring, the kind that coaxes the barley from the soil. This was a winter deluge, cold and unforgiving. It hammered against the earth with the violence of stones, turning the dusty courtyard outside into a churning mire of mud and debris. Inside the workshop, the air pressure dropped. Eldon could feel it in his ears, a popping sensation, and in the deep ache of his joints. He lay on his pallet beneath the high shelf, staring up at the rafters. The oil lamp he had left burning was flickering wildly now, casting frantic, jumping shadows that made the simple tools of his trade, the hanging wires, the sponges, the ribs, look like instruments of torture. Above him, the teal jar sat unmoved. It was the eye of the storm. While the world outside screamed and thrashed, the jar remained perfectly still, its glossy surface catching the erratic light, glowing with a serene, indifferent beauty. Scritch, scritch, thump. The sound came from the heavy oak door. It was distinct from the wind, a frantic, desperate rhythm. Eldon stiffened. He knew what it was. Marrow? The cry was muffled by the thick wood, but it cut through the noise of the storm like a needle. It was high, thin, and miserable. Shadow. Eldon imagined the creature out there. He pictured the grey fur, usually so soft, now plastered to the cat's skeletal frame by the freezing rain. He pictured the mud of the courtyard, cold and sucking at those small paws. He pictured the green eyes, wide with confusion, staring at the door that had always been open before. Scritch, scritch. Go away, Eldon whispered to the ceiling. Go find a barn. Go find the sheepfold. He pulled the wool blanket up over his ears. He tried to rationalise the cruelty. I cannot let him in. He argued with his own conscience. He's wet. He's covered in mud. If he comes in, he'll shake himself. He'll spray dirty water everywhere. He'll jump on the workbench. He might jump on the shelf. The jar was pure. The cat was unclean. There was a simple equation. Meow. The cry was louder now, more demanding. It was a plea for sanctuary. Eldon's heart gave a painful squeeze. He remembered the nights the cat had warmed his feet. He remembered the way the creature had chased the clay scraps, making him laugh for the first time in years. He sat up. His hand moved toward the latch. Just then, a clap of thunder shook the house. Boom! The ground trembled, the workshop walls vibrated, and on the high shelf, the jar gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shudder. It didn't move far, perhaps the width of a hair, but the movement caught the light. Eldon gasped. He froze. The fear of the jar breaking swamped the pity for the cat. The preservation of the masterpiece was the only thing that mattered. If he opened the door, the wind would rush in. The gust could knock things over. The cat could panic and bolt blindly. No, Eldon said, his voice hardening. It is too dangerous. He lay back down. He turned his back to the door. Outside, the scratching continued for another minute, frantic and pleading. And then it stopped. The silence that followed the scratching was worse than the noise. He has gone, Eldon told himself. He has found shelter under the cart or in the woodshed. Cats are resourceful. He's a survivor. But the image of the wet, shivering animal would not leave his mind. The storm raged on. The rain lashed against the roof tiles with increasing fury. The roof of the workshop was old, a combination of heavy timber beams and terracotta tiles, layered over with mud and straw. It had held for 50 years, but tonight the wind was testing every weakness. Above Eldon's head, near the chimney, there was a small skylight, a simple opening covered by a piece of oiled leather stretched over a wooden frame, designed to let in light but keep out dust. Thump. A new sound. Not at the door. On the roof. Eldon's eyes snapped open. He looked up. Scrabble. Slide. Scrabble. It was the sound of claws on wet clay tiles. Shadow had not given up. Denied the door. The creature was seeking the high ground. He was looking for warmth. He was drawn to the heat escaping from the chimney. Stupid beast, Eldon muttered, anxiety tightening his chest. Get down. You will fall. He heard the soft, padded footsteps moving across the tiles directly above the shelf. Creak. The old rafters groaned under the added weight of the wind and the rain. Eldon stared at the ceiling. He felt a sudden urge to get up, to go outside, to grab the cat and lock him in the woodshed, anything to stop this prowling above his treasure. But the warmth of the blanket was heavy, and the cold air of the room was biting, and the lethargy of old age pinned him down. He'll settle, Eldon thought. He will curl up by the chimney and sleep. It will be fine. He looked at the jar one last time. It shone in the gloom, a beacon of perfection. It seemed to say, I am worth more than a wet animal. I am eternal. Protect me. Eldon closed his eyes. He focused on the sound of the rain, trying to drown out the scratching on the roof. He drifted into a shallow, uneasy sleep. He dreamt he was drowning in the River Jordan, but the water wasn't water. It was liquid clay, thick and red, pulling him down, and on the bank, a giant teal jar sat watching him, indifferent to his struggle. Outside, on the slippery, rain-slicked tiles, a small, shivering shadow crept closer to the skylight, drawn by the faint scent of the oil lamp and the desperate need for warmth. The storm howled, drowning out the small sound of a loose tile shifting. Click. The boundary between sleep and wakefulness is a thin veil, easily torn. For Eldon, it was not torn by a shout or a bell, but by the sound of tearing leather. Rip. It came from directly above. Eldon's eyes flew open. For a second, he didn't know where he was. The oil lamp had burned down to its dregs, the flame now just a pathetic, sputtering blue bead drowning in the reservoir. The room was awash in erratic, leaping shadows. Crack! The wooden frame of the skylight, rotten from years of damp winters and now burdened by the sudden, shifting weight of a desperate animal, gave way. Eldon sat up, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Time seemed to curdle. It slowed down, stretching the next few seconds into an agonizing eternity. First came the rain. A sudden, cold slap of water poured through the broken skylight, dousing the floor and the pallet where Eldon lay. Then came the darkness. A shape fell from the hole in the roof. It was not a graceful descent. It was a flailing, chaotic tumble of wet fur and panic. Shadow, the cat, had lost his footing as the frame snapped. He did not jump. He fell. He landed hard. Fate, it seemed, possessed a cruel sense of geometry. The cat did not land on the floor. He landed on the high oak shelf, the pedestal. Thud. The shelf was sturdy. It held the weight. But the surface of the wood, polished to a high sheen by Eldon's own hands, was now instantly slick with the rain that was pouring in. Shadow scrambled. Eldon watched, paralysed by the horror of it. He saw the cat's claws extend, seeking purchase on the wet wood. Scritch. Scrape. The sound of bone against oak. The animal was terrified. Its eyes wide orbs of reflective green fire, its body low and skidding. In his panic to regain his balance, Shadow lashed out with his hind legs. He kicked backward. His paw connected with the base of the teal jar. To Eldon, it happened in silence. The roaring wind, the drumming rain, it all fell away. There was only the visual. He saw the jar tip. It didn't fall immediately. It hesitated. It teetered on the edge of the shelf, caught for a microsecond in a delicate, impossible equilibrium. The light from the dying lamp caught the glaze one last time, illuminating the carved vines, the deep teal waters, the perfection of the form. "No," Eldon croaked. The word was a puff of air, soundless. He reached out, His old gnarled hand clawed at the air, trying to bridge the 10 feet of distance between his pallet and the shelf. A futile, desperate gesture. The jar tipped past the point of no return. It fell. It did not float like a feather. It plummeted like a stone. Gravity, the potter's oldest enemy, claimed its due. The jar rotated once in the air, a heavy, dark planet falling out of orbit. Smash. The sound was not a dull thud. It was a violent, high-pitched explosion. It was the scream of tension being released. The sound of fired clay, stone that had once been soft, shattering against the unforgiving stone floor. It was the loudest sound Eldon had ever heard. It sounded like a bone breaking. It sounded like a church bell falling from a tower. Shards flew. They skittered across the stone floor like frightened beetles. A large, curved piece of the belly spun on its side, wub 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 wub, before settling into stillness. Then silence. The cat, terrified by the noise he had caused, leapt from the shelf. He landed on the floor, skidded on a shard, and scrambled frantically toward the window. Finding it latched, he squeezed himself into the smallest, darkest gap behind the clay sacks. Shaking uncontrollably, Eldon did not move. He sat on his pallet, the wool blanket pooling around his waist. The rain continued to fall through the broken skylight, a steady, cold drip that landed on his bare shoulder. He didn't feel it. He stared at the floor. There, in the puddle of rainwater and mud, lay his life's work. It was gone. The perfect symmetry? Gone. The singing rim? Gone. The narrative of the vines? Severed. What remained was a jagged pile of trash. Sharp edges. Useless rubble. The oil lamp gave one last sputter, a final gasp of light that illuminated the carnage, and then died. Darkness rushed in to fill the room. Eldon remained sitting in the dark. He felt a strange sensation in his chest, a hollowness, as if his own insides had been scooped out. He waited for the anger. He waited for the rage to rise up and make him scream, to make him hunt down the cat and wring its neck. But the anger did not come. Not yet. Instead, there was only a crushing, suffocating weight. The weight of old age. The weight of failure. God, he whispered into the dark. Why? It was not a theological question. It was the whimper of a child who has built a tower of blocks, only to have it kicked over by a careless passerby. He thought of the morning. He thought of the pilgrimage. He thought of the high priest. I have nothing, he said. I have nothing to bring. He pulled his knees to his chest. He shivered, but not from the cold. He shivered because for the first time in 50 years he was not a potter. A potter makes vessels. A potter creates form. He was just an old man sitting in the mud with a pile of broken crockery. Somewhere in the corner, he heard the cat let out a low, miserable moan. Shadow knew. Animals know when they have broken the world. Eldon didn't yell. He didn't throw a shoe. He simply laid his head down on his knees and closed his eyes, listening to the rain washing over the ruins of his masterpiece. The water mixed with the dust on the floor, turning it back into mud. From dust it came, and to dust it had returned. But Eldon could not see the poetry in it. He could only see the end. The numbness of the heart is a mercy, but it is a temporary one. Like a frost that temporarily kills the pain of a wound, the shock eventually thaws, and when it does, the agony returns with a vengeance. For Eldon, the thaw began with the cold. The rain continued to fall through the broken skylight, drumming a relentless, mocking rhythm on the floor. It soaked his tunic. It chilled his skin. He began to shiver violently, his teeth chattering in the darkness. He could not stay in the dark. He needed to see. He needed to know the extent of the death. He fumbled in the blackness, his hands shaking so badly he could barely control them. He found the tinderbox on the floor where it had fallen. He struck the flint. Once, twice. Sparks flew like tiny, angry stars, dying in the damp air. Finally, a piece of charcloth caught. He blew on it, the orange glow illuminating his hollow, terrified face. He lit a spare rushlight, a simple reed dipped in tallow. The weak, yellow light pushed back the shadows. Eldon lifted the light. The scene was worse than he had imagined. In the darkness, he had hoped, with the desperate, irrational hope of the grieving, that perhaps the jar had only cracked, perhaps it could be glued. But the light told the truth. The jar was obliterated. It lay in 100 pieces. The beautiful neck, with its graceful flare, was severed completely. The belly, where the vines had wound their way around the circumference, was shattered into jagged plates that looked like broken continents on a map. The base remained intact, a mocking stump of clay sitting upright in a puddle of water. Eldon crawled forward on his hands and knees. He reached out and picked up a large shard. It was a piece of the shoulder. The teal glaze shone wet and slick. He rubbed his thumb over the curve, a curve his hands had memorized. Slice. He gasped and dropped the shard. It had bitten him. The broken edge was razor sharp, sharper than any knife. A thin line of crimson blood welled up on his thumb, mixing with the rain and the dust on his hand. The physical pain broke the dam. A roar built up in Eldon's throat. It was a primal sound, guttural and raw. "Ruined!" he screamed. He slammed his fist into the floor. Thud. Ruined! All of it! A wasteland! He grabbed a handful of smaller shards and threw them against the wall. They shattered again, a cacophony of destruction, and he was destroying the destruction, trying to hurt the thing that had hurt him. Then he heard it, a low, terrified hiss from behind the clay sacks. Eldon froze. The rushlight in his hand trembled, casting wild shadows. He slowly turned his head. 2 green eyes reflected the candlelight. They were wide with terror. Shadow was pressed into the corner, making himself as small as possible. The cat knew. In the animal kingdom, vulnerability is a death sentence, and the cat sensed the violence in the air. Eldon stared at the creature. A moment ago, he had been a man of prayer. Now, he was a man of wrath. "You," Eldon whispered. The word was a curse. He stood up, towering over the corner. The rushlight made him look like a giant, his shadow stretching up to the ceiling. "I gave you milk," Eldon said, his voice rising. "I gave you shelter. I let you watch the creation. And this is your gratitude." He took a step forward. Shadow scrambled, trying to climb the wall, claws scratching uselessly against the stone. "You're a curse," Eldon yelled. "You're a thief. You have stolen my offering." He didn't think about the open skylight. He didn't think about the storm. He didn't think about the fact that it was an accident. He only saw the agent of his loss. He grabbed the broom again. "Out!" He swung the broom, hitting the sacks near the cat. Dust flew up. Shadow shrieked, a sound of pure panic, and bolted. He ran between Eldon's legs, skidding on the wet floor. Eldon spun around. "Get out. Never come back." He chased the cat to the heavy oak door. He threw the bolt back and yanked the door open. The wind hit him like a physical blow. The storm was raging. Rain lashed into his face, blinding him. Thunder rolled directly overhead, shaking the foundations of the earth. Shadow hesitated at the threshold. The night outside was a maelstrom. No creature would willingly go into that. Eldon didn't care. He swept the broom towards the animal. "Go!" Terrified by the man more than the storm, Shadow bolted. He shot out into the dark, wet courtyard and vanished instantly into the blackness. Eldon stood in the doorway for a moment, the wind tearing at his clothes, the rain mingling with the tears on his face. He screamed into the storm, a wordless cry of anguish that was swallowed instantly by the thunder. Then he slammed the door. Boom! He threw the bolt. He leaned his forehead against the rough wood of the door, breathing in ragged, sobbing gasps. He was alone. Truly alone. The jar was gone. The cat was gone. Sarah was gone. He turned back to the room. The rushlight had blown out in the draught from the door. He was in the dark again. He slid down the door until he was sitting on the floor. He pulled his knees up and buried his face in his arms. He waited for the satisfaction of justice. He waited to feel good about expelling the destroyer. But there was no satisfaction. There was only the cold, biting silence of the empty house, broken only by the sound of the rain weeping through the hole in the roof. His thumb throbbed where the shard had cut him. The blood dripped onto the floor, invisible in the dark. Eldon rocked back and forth. He felt small. He felt foolish. And beneath the anger, a new, colder realization began to set in. He had loved the clay more than the living, and now he had neither. The rage of an old man is like a brush fire in late autumn. It burns hot and fast, consuming the dry undergrowth of patience. But it lacks the fuel to last the night. Eldon sat against the door for a long time. The adrenaline that had powered his screaming and his sweeping began to drain away, leaving him trembling and cold. The heat of wrath evaporated, and in its place came the chill of reality. The room was freezing. The rain continued to fall through the broken skylight, but the storm outside was changing its temper. The thunder had rolled away to the east, rumbling like a retreating army, leaving behind a steady, weeping downpour. Eldon shivered. His teeth clicked together. He needed to move. If he stayed here on the wet stones, the damp would settle in his lungs, and at his age, that was a slow sentence of death. He pushed himself up. His knees protested with sharp pops of pain. He walked like a drunkard back toward the centre of the room. He found the tinderbox again. His hands were numb, clumsy blocks of wood, but he managed to light the small oil lamp, the spare one he kept on the lower shelf. The flame caught. A small, trembling halo of light pushed back the suffocating dark. Eldon turned to look at the floor. It is a terrible thing to look upon a corpse. It is perhaps even more terrible to look upon the corpse of a dream. The floor was a battlefield. The water from the roof had pooled around the shards, mixing with the dust to create a red slurry. In this mud lay the remains of the teal jar. The pieces were breathtakingly beautiful, even in death. A shard of the rim lay near his foot, its curve perfect, its edge sharp. A piece of the belly lay further away, the carved vine severed in mid-twist. Eldon sank to his knees. He didn't care about the wet floor anymore. He reached out and picked up the largest piece, the base. It was heavy, solid, and mute. The roots of the vine he'd carved were still there, anchoring nothing. "I am sorry," he whispered. He wasn't sure who he was apologising to. The jar? God? Or the silence? He looked at his thumb. The blood had dried into a dark, crusty line. He sucked on it, tasting the iron. The silence of the room began to press in on him. It was a physical pressure, ringing in his ears. It was a different kind of silence than he had ever known. Before, the silence of the workshop had been the companionable silence of creation, filled with potential. Then, it had been the shared silence with the cat, filled with life. Now, it was the silence of a tomb. He looked at the corner where the burlap sacks lay, the corner where Shadow used to sleep. It was empty. The image of the cat scrambled into his mind. He saw the green eyes wide with panic. He saw the skeletal ribs heaving. He felt the phantom vibration of the broom handle as he swept the creature out. What have I done? The question hit him with the force of a physical blow to the stomach. He had spent months trying to make a vessel worthy of God. He had purified the clay. He had purified the fire. He had carved the vines of faith. But in one moment of anger, he had revealed what was actually inside his own vessel. It wasn't faith. It wasn't love. It was pride. He had loved the object more than the life. He had loved the glory of the temple more than the mercy of the threshold. "I am the broken one," Eldon said aloud. His voice cracked. He dropped the base of the jar. Clack. He realised, with a sickening clarity, that the jar had to break. It was an idol. He had placed it on a pedestal, literally and spiritually. He had worshipped the work of his own hands. But realisation brings no comfort in the middle of the night. It only brings a deeper shade of darkness. Eldon began to crawl around the floor. He didn't know why, but he felt he couldn't leave the pieces scattered like trash. It felt disrespectful. He gathered them. He picked up a shard of the neck. He picked up a triangular piece of the shoulder. He picked up the tiny splinters that pricked his fingertips. He moved with the slow, agonising deliberation of a penitent. He gathered the wet, sharp pieces into a pile in the centre of the room, directly under the leak. He took off his outer tunic, his heavy wool cloak, and laid it over the pile. He covered the ruin. He shrouded the dead. He was left in his thin under-tunic, shivering violently. He couldn't fix the roof tonight. He couldn't fix the jar. He couldn't bring the cat back. He walked to the door. He placed his hand on the wood. He wanted to open it. He wanted to call out into the night. "Shadow, come back!" But shame paralysed his hand. What right did he have to call? He was the storm now. He withdrew his hand. He went to his pallet, which was soaked. He dragged it to the driest corner of the room, near the kiln wall which still held a faint, ghostly warmth from days ago. He lay down. He curled into a tight ball, trying to preserve his own body heat. The hollow chest. That was what it felt like. It felt as if his ribs were the staves of a barrel that had burst, leaving nothing inside but empty space and wind. He closed his eyes, but sleep did not come. Instead, the memories came. He remembered the way Shadow would nudge his hand for milk. He remembered the way Sarah would look at a cracked pot and say, "It can still hold dry grain. Eldon, don't throw it away." Tears, hot and stinging, finally leaked from his eyes. They tracked through the dust on his face, finding the creases of his wrinkles. God, he prayed. But it wasn't a prayer of words. It was a prayer of exhaustion. I am a pot of shards. I am useless. Do with me what you will. Outside, the rain softened to a whisper, and the wind died down. The world was weeping quietly. And inside the workshop, the old potter lay on the floor, stripped of his pride, stripped of his masterpiece, stripped of his companion. He was finally, truly empty. And only an empty vessel can be filled. But Eldon did not know that yet. He only knew the dark. Morning arrived, not with a fanfare, but with a cold, pale clarity. The storm had scrubbed the sky clean. The grey clouds had been swept away, leaving behind a dome of piercing, brittle blue. The light that poured through the eastern window and through the jagged hole in the roof was white and unforgiving. It did not hide the dust. It did not soften the edges. It revealed everything. Eldon woke with a gasp. His body was a map of aches. The stone floor had leached the warmth from his bones during the night, leaving his joints stiff and rusty. He sat up, groaning, pulling the thin wool of his undertunic tight around his chest. For a moment, just a brief, merciful moment, he forgot. He looked towards the high shelf, expecting to see the teal glint of the jar catching the morning sun. He saw only the empty wood, stained dark by the rain. Then he looked down. In the centre of the room, beneath the drip that had now slowed to a periodic plink, lay the mound covered by his heavy outer cloak. It looked like a small body. It looked like a grave. Memory flooded back, cold and sharp as the water on the floor. Eldon closed his eyes, fighting the urge to lie back down and let the darkness take him again. But the light was too strong. The day had begun, indifferent to his tragedy. He stood up, his knees cracked. He walked to the mound. He reached down and grasped the hem of his sodden cloak. He pulled it away. There they were, the remains. In the harsh light of day, the violence of the break was even more apparent. The beautiful teal glaze, which yesterday had seemed like a deep ocean, was now just coloured skin on broken bone. The red clay body was exposed, rough and granular. Eldon stared at them. He expected to feel the rage return. He expected to feel the urge to grab a shovel, scoop this debris into a basket and hurl it into the ravine behind the house. Bury it, his mind whispered. Hide your shame. But as he looked, something strange happened. A ray of sunlight, filtering through the dust motes, struck a large shard from the belly of the jar. It was the piece that held the central knot of the vine he'd carved. The light didn't just bounce off the glaze, it seemed to catch on the jagged edge of the break. The edge sparkled. Eldon knelt. He ignored the wet floor soaking his knees. He picked up the shard. He turned it over in his hand. It was broken, yes, but it was not garbage. It was interrupted. He picked up a second piece, a triangle of the shoulder. He brought it close to the first piece. His hands, usually so shaky, moved with a sudden, intense focus. He rotated the pieces. He adjusted the angle. Click. The two pieces locked together. The fit was so tight, so perfect, that for a second, the seam almost vanished. The vine on the belly connected to the vine on the shoulder. The line flowed. Eldon held his breath. He wasn't looking at a pile of trash anymore. He was looking at a puzzle. He was looking at a map that had been torn apart. A memory surfaced from the deep wells of his childhood. He heard the voice of his grandfather, a man who had known the old ways. He remembered sitting by the fire, watching his grandfather mend a torn fishing net. Eldon, the old man had said, his fingers tying knots with blind speed. Do not despise the tear. The tear is where the light gets in. The mended net catches the most fish, because it has learned the lesson of the strain. And then, a verse from the scrolls, one he had heard chanted in the synagogue 1,000 times, but never truly heard until now. He heals the broken-hearted and binds up their wounds. Binds up. God didn't throw the broken-hearted away. He did not sweep them into the ravine. He bound them. He mended them. Eldon looked at the pile of shards. If God does not throw me away, he whispered, his voice raspy with morning phlegm, then I cannot throw you away. A tiny spark of purpose ignited in the cold ash of his heart. It was not the roaring fire of ambition he had felt before. It was a small, quiet flame, the flame of duty. He stood up. He walked to the water barrel. He filled a large earthenware basin with clean water. He gathered a soft sponge and a clean linen cloth. He returned to the pile. He sat cross-legged on the wet floor. He picked up the first shard, the heavy base. He dipped it into the water. The water turned red as the mud and dust washed away. Eldon scrubbed it gently. He cleaned the jagged edges, removing the grit that would prevent a clean join. He dried it with the linen cloth. He set it down on a dry patch of floor. He picked up the next piece. Wash, scrub, dry, place. It was a ritual. It was a baptism of the broken. As he worked, the sun climbed higher. The room began to warm. The silence was no longer oppressive. It was meditative. He washed the neck. He washed the rim. He washed the tiny, fingernail-sized chips that he had almost missed. He laid them out on the floor, not in a pile, but spread out like an autopsy, or perhaps like the parts of a clock. He began to see the relationships between them. This piece goes here, that piece goes there. He realised something profound. The jar was still there. Its form had not been destroyed. It had only been disassembled. The ghost of the vessel was hovering over the pieces, waiting to be incarnated again. But how? Glue made of pine resin would be too weak. Clay slip would not work on fired pottery. He needed something stronger. He needed something that would not just hold the pieces together, but would honour the fact that they had been apart. He looked at his hands, the hands that had created and the hands that had destroyed. They were clean now, washed by the same water that cleaned the shards. He thought of the box hidden beneath the loose stone under his sleeping pallet, the box he hadn't opened in years. The thought made his stomach turn over. No, he thought, That is for my burial. That is all I have left. But then he looked at the shards again. They looked naked. They looked like they were waiting for him. You gave your life for my pride, Eldon whispered to the clay. I must give my life for your healing. He stood up, drying his hands on his tunic. He walked to the corner where his pallet lay. He knelt down and pried up the loose flagstone. Beneath it lay a small box of olive wood, polished and dark with age. He lifted it out. It was heavy. He carried it to the centre of the room, amidst the clean, drying field of teal shards. He sat down. He placed the box on his lap. He took a deep breath, the air smelling of rain and wet stone. He opened the lid. The lid of the box creaked open on brass hinges that had stiffened with time. Inside, resting on a bed of faded crimson wool, lay two objects. They were small circles of metal, unassuming in their simplicity, yet they seemed to catch every photon of light in the dim room and amplify it. Two gold bands. One was thick and heavy, hammered from a nugget of pure river gold. It was scarred with 1,000 tiny scratches, the marks of a life spent gripping tools, lifting stone, and fighting the earth. This was Eldon's wedding band. He had taken it off 3 years ago, on the day he buried Sarah, because his knuckles had swollen so much from arthritis that the gold threatened to cut off his circulation. The other was slender, delicate, almost fragile, most. It was etched with a faint pattern of wheat stalks, worn nearly smooth by 40 years of washing, kneading, and stroking the brows of feverish children. Sarah's ring. Eldon stared at them. This was not just jewellery. This was his survival. In Oakhaven, there were no pensions for old potters. When his hands finally failed him completely, and that day was close, these 2 ounces of gold were all that stood between him and begging at the city gates. This was his bread. This was his burial shroud. He reached out and touched Sarah's ring. The metal was cold, but it burned his fingertip. To mend a pot with gold, he whispered, the absurdity of the thought tasting like ash in his mouth. It is madness. Any sane man would say so. A clay jar, even a beautiful one, is worth perhaps 3 silver shekels. These rings were worth 100. To pour a fortune into a ruin was bad economics. It was wasteful. But Eldon looked up from the box to the floor. He saw the shards of the teal jar scrubbed clean, laid out like the bones of a saint. They were waiting. They were expectant. The jar had broken because of his anger. It had died because he had valued his own pride over a living creature. The debt he owed to this clay was not financial, it was spiritual. You cannot pay a spiritual debt with copper or silver. You can only pay it with something that bleeds, or something that costs you your future. It is not waste, Eldon said, his voice gaining a sudden, terrifying firmness. It is ransom. He made his decision. He did not let himself think about the winter nights without firewood. He did not think about the hunger that might come next year. He thought only of the line of the vine that needed to be reconnected. He stood up. He carried the box to the workbench. He needed gold dust. He could not melt the rings. He had no crucible hot enough for gold. He had to reduce them to powder. He searched through his tools until he found a heavy iron file, a rasp used for sharpening axe blades. It was coarse and brutal. He took a sheet of clean black vellum and laid it on the table to catch the dust. He picked up his own ring first, the heavy one. He held it between his thumb and forefinger. He pressed the edge of the ring against the teeth of the file. He paused. His heart hammered against his ribs. To destroy this ring felt like divorcing his past. It felt like erasing the day he stood under the canopy with Sarah, young and strong, promising her the world for the healing, he whispered. Scrunch. The sound was hideous. It was the scream of metal being torn apart. Eldon flinched, but he didn't stop. He pushed the ring down the length of the file. Scrunch. A fine shower of yellow dust fell onto the black vellum. It glittered like captured starlight. Scrunch! Scrunch! He fell into a rhythm. The work was hard. Gold is soft, But the ring was thick. His arm ached. The sound filled the silent workshop, a harsh, rhythmic penance. With every stroke of the file, the ring grew thinner. The circle that had symbolised eternity was being broken down into atoms. Eldon sweated. Tears leaked from his eyes, mixing with the sweat. But he didn't wipe them away. He watched the pile of gold dust grow. It was a beautiful, tragic heap. Halfway through the first ring, his fingers cramped. He stopped to breathe. The ring was now a crescent moon, its circle broken. He looked at Sarah's ring sitting on the table. "I will not take you," he said to it softly. "Not yet." He hoped his own ring would be enough. He wanted to keep hers. He wanted to keep one small circle unbroken. He went back to work. An hour passed. The sun climbed to its zenith, heating the room. The pile of dust on the vellum was substantial now, a small pyramid of pure value. When the last sliver of his ring disintegrated under the file, Eldon dropped the tool. His hand was trembling violently. He stared at the dust. It looked like pollen from a flower that grew only in paradise. Now, the binder. He went to the shelf where he kept his jars of glaze and pigments. He reached for a small, wax-sealed pot at the back. It contained the resin of the terebinth tree, a thick, sticky sap that smelled of turpentine and deep forests. It was an ancient adhesive, strong enough to huff a spearhead. He scooped a dollop of the dark amber-coloured resin onto a mixing stone. Then, with the blade of a palette knife, he carefully swept the gold dust into the resin. He began to mix. He folded the gold into the sap. The dark amber turned opaque. It swirled with streaks of yellow fire. He mixed until the paste was uniform, a heavy, golden lacquer. It was no longer just glue, it was liquid light. Eldon looked at the mixture. It was the most expensive substance he had ever touched. It was his retirement, his safety, and his history, all reduced to a tablespoon of sticky paste. He felt a strange lightness, the fear of poverty, which had dogged him all morning and had vanished. He had nothing left to lose. He had thrown it all into the mortar. He walked over to the floor where the shards lay. He carried the mixing stone like a priest carrying the Eucharist. He sat down. He picked up the first two pieces he'd matched earlier, the base and a large triangular shard of the lower belly. He dipped a small, fine-haired brush into the gold lacquer. He painted the edge of the shard. The gold paste went on thick and smooth where it covered the rough, red clay of the break. It didn't try to hide the jaggedness. It highlighted it. He pressed the two pieces together. He held them. He applied pressure, steady and firm. The excess gold oozed out from the seam, forming at a raised line, a vein of gold running through the teal body. Eldon didn't wipe it away. He watched it settle. It was beautiful. It was more striking than the unbroken perfection had ever been. The line of gold cut across the carved roots of the vine, creating a new geometry. It looked like lightning frozen in time. "Hold," Eldon whispered to the clay. "Hold on to this." He sat there, his hands serving as the clamps, waiting for the resin to tack. He felt the vibration of his own pulse transferring into the clay. He was poor now. He had no gold ring on his finger, and no gold ring in his box. But as he watched the two pieces become one, bonded by the sacrifice of his security, Eldon felt a richness that made the high priest's breastplate look like costume jewellery. He was mending the world, one golden seam at a time. And in the silence of the workshop, with the smell of pine resin and rain in the air, the work of redemption began. The air in the workshop had changed. Before, it smelled of wet earth and rain. Now, it smelled of something ancient and resinous, a sharp balsamic scent of terebinth and pine, like the interior of a deep forest heated by the noon sun. It was the smell of binding. Eldon sat motionless on the floor. He was a statue dedicated to the god of patience. His left hand cradled the base of the jar. His right hand pressed a large curved shard against it. He could not move. The gold lacquer was not like the mud mortar used for bricks. It did not dry instantly. It required time to cure. It had to be held in a state of suspended tension, neither pushed too hard nor held too loosely, until the resin remembered that it was supposed to be solid. Eldon watched the seam. A thin bead of gold had squeezed out from between the two pieces of clay. It caught the light from the open door, glowing with an intensity that seemed to burn his retinas. 1 minute passed. 2. A cramp began to whisper in the muscle of his right thumb. It started as a low hum of discomfort, then rose to a sharp, biting pitch. His old tendons, stiff with arthritis, screamed for release. They wanted to let go. They wanted to shake out the tension. Hold, Eldon commanded his hand. You broke it. You must hold it. He closed his eyes and breathed. He visualized the resin deep inside the crack. He imagined the sticky, amber molecules linking arms with the clay particles, pulling them together, turning two distinct islands into a single continent. He thought about how easy destruction was. It took less than a second for the jar to fall. Gravity was fast. Chaos was instantaneous. But restoration was agonizingly slow. It fought against the natural order of things. The universe wants things to fall apart. It takes a stubborn will to hold them together. 3 minutes. The shards shifted microscopically under his thumb. The resin was getting tacky. It was grabbing. Eldon slowly, terrifyingly slowly, released the pressure. He pulled his thumb away, millimetre by millimetre, afraid that the bond would fail and the piece would slide off with a wet slap. It held. The shard stood upright, defying gravity, anchored by the gold. Eldon exhaled a long, shuddering breath that emptied his lungs. He looked at the result. It was just one piece. The jar was still a ruin. But that single golden line, jagged and bright against the deep teal glaze, was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. It looked like a river of fire cutting through a dark landscape. 1, he whispered. He reached for the next piece. This was a smaller fragment, shaped like a diamond. It belonged to the lower belly, fitting into the notch created by the piece he had just attached. He painted the edges with the gold paste. He was getting better at it now. He applied just enough, a thin, uniform layer that would bond without dripping. He slotted the piece in. Click. It was a silent click, felt rather than heard. The pottery locked into its original position. Again, the hold. Again, the weight. The afternoon wore on. The square of sunlight on the floor moved from the west wall to the east, stretching and distorting as the day aged. Eldon did not rise to eat. He did not rise to drink. He was fed by a strange, quiet adrenaline. He was building a puzzle in 3 dimensions. As the wall of the jar began to rise again, the physics became more difficult. The pieces were no longer resting on the base. They were hanging in the air, supported only by the pieces below them. Gravity began to fight him. The wet resin acted as a lubricant before it acted as a glue. The heavy shards wanted to slide down. Eldon had to improvise. He looked around the floor. He saw the small bags of sand he used for weighting down leather-hard plates. He dragged them closer with his foot. He propped the sandbags against the outside of the jar, creating a soft, supportive cradle for the drying walls. He used balls of wet clay to prop up the pieces from the inside. He was no longer just a potter. He was an architect of ruins. He worked his way up the belly of the jar. He came to the section of the vine. This was the most critical part. The carving he had done, the twisted branch of the grapevine, had been severed cleanly in 2. He painted the gold on the break. He pressed the pieces together. The gold filled the gap in the vine. Eldon stared. Before, the vine had been a carving of shadows. Now, the vine had a vein of gold running through its heart. It looked as though the sap of the plant had turned to light. The wound had become the focal point of the art. It is not hiding the damage, Eldon realised. It is illuminating it. He paused to mix more lacquer. He had to file the edges of the remaining gold ring, Sarah's ring. He had hoped to save it, but the jar was hungry. It demanded everything. He didn't hesitate this time. He took the file to the small wheat-patterned band. Scrunch! The sound was softer this time, perhaps because the ring was thinner, or perhaps because his heart was no longer resisting the cost. He mixed the dust. He painted the shards. By the time the sun began to dip below the windowsill, turning the light in the room to a dusty violet, the body of the jar was complete. It sat on the floor, minus its neck. It looked like a crown. The teal glaze was crisscrossed with a web of gold veins. It was a map of a broken world, pieced back together by a stubborn love. It was no longer the smooth, perfect object that had sat on the pedestal. It was rugged. It was scarred. It looked like it had survived a war. Eldon sat back on his heels. His back was screaming in protest. His fingers were stained with amber resin and gold dust. He felt a deep, vibrating silence in the room. It wasn't the empty silence of last night. It was the heavy, satisfied silence of a harvest. He looked at the neck pieces, the delicate, fluted rim that lay separately on the cloth. That would be the hardest part. The neck had to support the weight of the water. It had to be strong. "Tomorrow," he whispered to the jar. "Tomorrow we crown you." He carefully placed a damp cloth over the resin pot to keep it from hardening. He covered the mended jar with a dry sheet of linen, tenting it so it wouldn't touch the sticky seams. He stood up, groaning as his hips unlocked. He walked to the door and opened it. The courtyard was muddy but calm. The storm had passed completely. The air was fresh and cool. He looked down at the threshold where he had stood last night, screaming into the wind. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of absence. "Shadow," he called softly. There was no answer, only the rustle of the olive leaves. Eldon stepped out into the mud. He walked to the woodshed. He peered under the ox cart. "Shadow, I have no milk, but I have a warm fire." Silence. The cat was gone. Eldon felt the weight of his penance return. He had mended the jar, but he had not mended the relationship. The clay could be fixed with gold. But a frightened heart? What glue could fix that? He went back inside. He left the door unlatched, just a crack. He lay down on his pallet, his eyes fixed on the linen-shrouded shape in the centre of the room. It glowed faintly in the gloom, the gold seams catching the last of the twilight. He closed his eyes, and his hands, still sticky with resin, curled into fists as he drifted into sleep. In his dreams, he was trying to glue the wind back together. The sun had shifted its weight to the western window, casting long, slanted rectangles of light across the workshop floor. The air was thick with the silence of deep afternoon, a silence that felt heavier than usual because it was shared by an object that commanded reverence. The body of the jar sat on the low table, swaddled in soft linen rags to protect the damp seams. It was headless. The belly was full and round, the shoulder sloped inward, but where the neck should have been, there was only a jagged, gaping hole, a mouth screaming silently at the ceiling. Eldon sat before it. His neck ached from hours of bending. His fingers were stiff claws, stained dark with the oxidation of the resin. On the cloth before him lay the remaining pieces, the fragments of the neck and the rim. This was the architecture of grace. The body of a jar holds the water, but the neck controls the flow. It is the channel. It is the throat through which the offering must pass. If the neck is crooked, the pouring is clumsy. If the rim is rough, the water is insulted. "Steady," Eldon whispered to his own hands. He picked up the first shard of the neck. It was a curved piece of clay, thin and delicate, flaring out at the top to form the lip. He dipped his brush into the gold lacquer. The pot of resin was running low. He had used almost all of his own ring on the body. Now, he was using Sarah's ring, the fine wheat-patterned band that he had ground into dust just an hour ago. He painted the edge. He did not attach it to the jar yet. gravity would pull it down before the glue could set. He had to build the neck separately, as a ring, and then crown the jar with it. He placed the shard upside down on a flat board. He painted the next piece. He pressed them together. It was like building a small, fragile tower. The gold paste oozed between the thin walls of the clay. Eldon wiped the excess away with a scrap of silk, leaving only a hairline fracture of light. He worked with the breath held in his lungs, releasing it only in shallow sips. As the circle of the neck began to close, Eldon noticed something. There was a gap. He counted the shards, he arranged them. But no matter how he turned them, there was a small triangular space on the rim where the clay had simply disintegrated into dust upon impact. A piece the size of a fingernail was missing. Gone. Eldon stared at the gap. A broken rim. In the lore of the temple, a vessel with a chipped rim was unclean. It could not be used for holy water. It was flawed. Despair, cold and familiar, began to creep up Eldon's spine. He had mended the body, yes. But if the mouth was imperfect, the jar was disqualified. He looked at the small pot of gold lacquer. He looked at the pile of gold dust that remained on the black vellum, the last remains of Sarah's ring. He remembered the Kintsugi philosophy. Though he did not know the word, the flaw is the feature. I cannot hide the lack, he realised. I must fill it. He took the remaining gold dust. All of it. He poured it into the resin. He made a paste that was so thick it was almost like putty. It was no longer glue. It was solid gold held together by a whisper of sap. He took his palette knife. He scooped up the glob of gold. He pressed it into the triangular gap in the rim. He sculpted it. He smoothed it with his thumb, blending the gold into the teal glaze on either side. He shaped the curve of the lip until it was perfect. Not perfect clay, but perfect metal. The gap was gone. In its place shone a solid wedge of gold. It was a halo. Eldon sat back. The neck ring was complete. It sat on the board, a circle of teal interrupted by veins of lightning with one solid gold tooth shining at the top. It was breathtaking. Now came the coronation. The resin on the neck ring had tacked up. It was firm enough to move, but sticky enough to bond. Eldon lifted the neck ring with both hands. He felt the fragility of it. It weighed nothing, yet it carried the weight of his entire pilgrimage. He turned to the body of the jar. He painted the jagged opening of the jar's shoulder with a fresh coat of lacquer. He hovered the neck over the body. He had to align it perfectly. The vines he'd carved on the neck had to match the vines on the shoulder. The flow had to be continuous. He lowered it. Touch. The gold met the gold. The clay met the clay. Eldon made micro-adjustments. Twist left, a fraction to the right, the lines of the vine locked into place. The gold seam on the neck connected with the gold seam on the shoulder, creating a continuous river of light that ran from the rim down to the base. He pressed down, gently, firmly. Bind, he commanded. Become one. He held it there for 10 minutes. The muscles in his shoulders burned like fire. Sweat dripped from his nose, landing on the workbench. But he did not flinch. He was the clamp. He was the gravity. Finally, the resin grabbed. The neck stood on its own. Eldon slowly withdrew his hands. He stepped back. The jar stood in the centre of the room. It was no longer the teal jar. That object had died 3 nights ago. This was something else. It was a mosaic of trauma and triumph. The web of gold lines wrapped around the vessel like a net of stars. The teal glaze, once cool and detached, now seemed deep and tragic, intensified by the warm glow of the metal. And at the top, the rim, the halo, caught the last ray of the setting sun and flared with a blinding brilliance. It was scarred. It was terrible. And it was the most holy thing Eldon had ever seen. "It is finished," he whispered. He felt a sudden, crushing exhaustion. The adrenaline that had sustained him for 2 days evaporated, leaving him hollowed out. He slumped onto his stool. He looked at his hands. They were empty. The rings were gone. The gold was gone. His security was gone. All he had was this pot. "You'd better be worth it," he said to the jar, his voice cracking with a mixture of awe and fear. He heard a sound at the door. Creak. Eldon spun around, hope flaring in his chest. Shadow. But the door only moved in the wind. The courtyard beyond was empty. A few dry leaves skittered across the threshold. The bowl of milk he had left out yesterday was untouched. A film of dust had settled on the surface. Eldon's shoulders slumped. The victory of the jar was sour in his mouth. He had saved the object, but he had lost the friend. He walked to the door. He picked up the bowl of spoiled milk and poured it out onto the thirsty ground. He refilled it with fresh water from his own cup. "I am here," he spoke into the twilight. "The door is open." He left the door unlatched again. He went back inside. He couldn't risk moving the jar yet. It needed to cure. The resin needed to harden into stone. He built a protective wall around the jar using heavy books and blocks of wood, so that if, God forbid, a rat or a draught disturbed it, it would not fall. Then he blew out the lamp. He lay down on his pallet in the dark. The smell of the resin was strong, filling his lungs. It smelled of healing. In the darkness, the gold seams on the jar were invisible, but Eldon could feel them vibrating in the air. He touched his own ring finger. The skin was pale where the band had been for 40 years. The indentation was still there, a ghost of the gold. "I am marked too," he thought. He drifted into sleep, his hand resting on the floor, palm open, as if waiting for a small, furry weight to fill it. But the night remained empty, and the only presence in the room was the silent, glittering vessel that watched over him like a seraphim with a broken wing. Time, in the workshop of a mender, does not tick, it breathes. For 2 days, the jar sat untouched in the centre of the room. It was surrounded by an invisible perimeter of patience. The air around it smelled thick and sharp, a heady mix of pine forests and deep earth, as the terebinth resin slowly exhaled its solvents and hardened into stone. Eldon moved through the room like a ghost, careful not to disturb the air currents. He did not sweep the floor, fearing the dust might settle on the tacky gold. He did not open the windows wide, fearing a sudden draught. He lived in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the chemistry of binding to finish its silent work. He spent the hours preparing for the journey. He was not a young man. The road to Jerusalem was uphill, a grueling ascent from the valleys of Oakhaven to the heights of Zion. It was a journey of 3 days for a man with strong legs. For Eldon, it might take 5. He gathered his provisions, a leather water skin, cracked but watertight, a bag of dried figs and almonds, a small loaf of hard barley bread. He packed them into his satchel with slow, deliberate movements. But his mind was constantly on the jar. On the afternoon of the second day, he approached it. He extended a finger. He touched the thickest seam of gold on the belly of the vessel. It was hard. It was cool. It did not yield. The resin had cured. The gold was no longer a liquid paste. It was a solid vein of metal running through the clay. "It is time," Eldon whispered. He needed to clean it. The mending had left residue, smudges of sticky resin and stray dust on the teal glaze. He took a piece of soft lambskin and a small bowl of olive oil. He began to polish the jar. He worked in small circles. Rub, wipe, shine. As he removed the dull film of the resin, the true nature of the object was revealed. The teal glaze, deep and mysterious, shone with a glassy brilliance. And the gold lines, they did not just sit on the surface. They seemed to float within the glaze, electric and alive. Eldon stopped polishing and simply stared. He realised he was looking at a map. The jagged line running down the side looked like the Jordan Rift Valley. The complex web of cracks on the shoulder looked like the lightning storms over the Sea of Galilee. And the gold halo on the rim, it looked like the sunrise over the Mount of Olives. It was a map of the Holy Land written in breakage. "I tried to make you perfect," Eldon said to the jar, his voice thick with emotion. "But you chose to be real." He understood then, with a sudden, quiet clarity, that the jar was no longer his offering. When it was perfect, it was a testament to his skill. Now that it was broken and mended, it was a testament to something else, something older. It was a testament to mercy. He finished polishing. The jar gleamed. It was heavy with the weight of the gold and the resin. It felt substantial, solid, indestructible. Now, he had to pack it. He could not just throw it in a sack. It was too precious. Eldon went to the corner where his old tools lay. He found a sturdy wooden crate used for shipping clay bricks. It was rough and splintered. He took his own sleeping mat, the thick woolen fleece he slept on during the winter. It was the only comfort he had left in the house. He cut it. Snip. Rip. He lined the inside of the wooden crate with the soft, thick wool. He created a nest, a womb of safety. He lifted the jar. "Into the ark you go," he whispered. He lowered the vessel into the crate. The wool hugged it, swallowing the gold and teal into its creamy depths. The jar fit perfectly. It was safe from the bumps of the road, safe from the jostling of the crowds. Eldon secured the lid of the crate with rope. He tied it tightly, his knots practiced and secure. He tested the straps he would use to carry it on his back. It was heavy, burdenously heavy. He slipped his arms through the straps and lifted the crate. He grunted under the weight. It pulled at his shoulders. It pressed on his spine. Good, he thought. A penance should have weight. He set the crate down near the door. He was ready. The sun was setting on Oakhaven. The light was turning that familiar, bruised purple that signalled the end of the day. Eldon opened the heavy oak door. He looked out into the courtyard. The mud had dried into a crusty, cracked surface. The olive tree stood motionless in the twilight. He looked at the bowl of water he had left out. It was full. A dead leaf floated on the surface. No tongue had lapped at it. No thirsty creature had visited. Eldon felt a hollow ache in his chest, a crack that no gold could fill. He stepped out. He walked to the edge of the property, where the wild grass met the road. "Shadow," he called. His voice was thin in the vast evening air. "Shadow, I am leaving. Come home." A crow answered him from the top of a cypress tree. "Caw, caw." Silence followed. Eldon stood there until the stars began to prick the sky. He felt the vast indifference of the world. The cat was gone. Perhaps it was dead. Perhaps it had found a warmer house, a kinder master. The thought stung him, jealousy mixed with relief. "If you have found a better fire, stay there," Eldon whispered to the wind. "I do not deserve you." He walked back to the workshop. He did not bolt the door tonight. He left it slightly ajar, propped open with a stone. If the cat returned while he was gone, let him find shelter. Let him find the dry corner. Eldon sat down on the floor, leaning against the crate that held the jar. He ate his simple dinner of bread and water. The workshop felt strange. It was no longer a place of work. It was a transit station. The wheel was still. The kiln was cold. The clay was covered. He was a man between lives. The life of the potter was over. The life of the pilgrim was about to begin. He looked at his hands in the dim light. They were clean of clay, but stained with the gold dust that had settled into the deep creases of his skin. He rubbed them together. "Tomorrow, we walk," he said to the silence. "Tomorrow, we face the priests." He pulled his thin cloak around him. He did not sleep on the wool mat tonight. It was in the crate. He slept on the hard floor, his head resting on his arm. He slept fitfully, dreaming of roads. He dreamed of a road paved not with stones, but with shards of blue pottery. And at the end of the road, a gate made of gold that was actually a scar. And in the dream, a small grey shadow walked beside him, its tail held high, guiding him home. When he woke, it was still dark, but he knew, by the smell of the air, that the dawn was coming. The departure of a pilgrim is a quiet thing. There were no trumpets, no farewell speeches, no weeping relatives clutching at his hem. There was only the sound of a leather strap being tightened and the click of a wooden latch. Eldon stood in the doorway of his workshop one last time. The sky to the east was bleeding a faint, watery grey, the precursor to dawn. The air was cold and still, holding the moisture of the dew that clung to the olive trees. Eldon adjusted the crate on his back. It was heavy, heavier than he'd remembered from his practice lifts. The wooden edges pressed against his spine through the thin fabric of his tunic. The leather straps dug into the hollows of his collarbones. He looked back into the room. It was a shell. The wheel was silent. The shelves were empty. The floor was swept clean of shards, though the ghost of the breakage still lingered in the damp stains on the stone. He looked at the door. He bent down and picked up a heavy river stone. He wedged it firmly against the doorframe, ensuring the heavy oak planks would not swing shut in the wind. A gap of 6 inches remained, wide enough for a grey, scrawny body to slip through, but narrow enough to keep out the wolves. "The house is yours," he whispered to the emptiness. "If you want it." He turned his back on Oakhaven. He began to walk. The first mile was the hardest, not because of the terrain, but because of the leaving. Every step away from the workshop felt like a betrayal of his sanctuary. He was leaving the only place where he was a master, walking into a world where he was just an old man with a box. The road out of the village was a narrow track of packed dirt and limestone, winding its way up the side of the valley. It was the way of the flocks, used mostly by shepherds and goats. Crunch, crunch, crunch. His sandals, worn thin at the heels, struck the gravel with a rhythmic monotony. This was the liturgy of the feet. As he climbed, the sun began to break over the ridge. It didn't rise gently, it erupted. One moment, the hills were grey silhouettes. The next, they were ablaze with the golden fire. The limestone rocks glowed like hot coals. The wild grasses, dried by the summer heat, shimmered like spun copper. Eldon stopped to catch his breath. He turned to look back at the valley. Oakhaven was a smudge of green and brown far below. He could just make out the roof of his workshop, a tiny square of terracotta tiles. It looked insignificant. From this height, his entire life, his struggles, his grief, his art, looked small enough to be covered by a thumb. "Forward," he grunted. He turned back to the ascent. By mid-morning he reached the main road, the pilgrim's way that led south to Jerusalem. Here, the solitude ended. The road was a river of humanity. It was crowded with the faithful travelling to the temple. There were families from Galilee, walking in large, noisy groups, singing psalms to pass the time. There were merchants on donkeys, their saddlebags bulging with wares. There were Pharisees in long, fringed robes, walking with practised dignity, their eyes fixed on the horizon. Eldon stepped into the flow. He felt instantly invisible. He was a speck in the current. He walked on the edge of the road in the rougher dust, to avoid being trampled by the donkeys. The dust rose in choking clouds, coating his throat, turning his white beard a dull beige. It tasted of limestone and manure. He kept his head down. He focused on the ground. Step, step. Avoid the rock. Step. The crate on his back became a torture device. The sun, now high and fierce, beat down on the wood, heating the air inside the box. Eldon worried about the resin. Would it soften? Would the jar collapse in the heat? Hold together, he prayed silently. Do not melt. He was slower than the others. Groups passed him constantly. Children ran past him, laughing, chasing each other with sticks, their energy boundless. Young men strode past with long, confident gaits. Eldon plodded. He was the tortoise among hares. "Make way, grandfather," a voice shouted. Eldon stumbled sideways into the ditch as a cart, pulled by 2 sweating oxen, rumbled past. The wooden wheels groaned under the weight of grain sacks. The driver didn't even look at him. Eldon righted himself. He checked the straps. He checked the crate. He felt a sudden bitter flush of shame. He looked like a beggar. He looked like a vagrant carrying his worldly possessions in a box. No one knew that on his back he carried a king's ransom in gold and art. They saw only the bent back and the dusty tunic. Is this what I am, he thought? Just an obstacle in the road? But then he remembered the jar inside. He remembered the scars. He remembered that the jar, too, had been discarded. It had been trash on a wet floor. "We are a pair, you and I," he muttered, wiping sweat from his eyes. Two broken things walking to God. The thought gave him a strange strength. He wasn't walking for status. He was walking for delivery. By noon, the heat was a physical weight, pressing down on the top of his head. The landscape was harsh, rolling hills of dry grass, punctuated by jagged outcroppings of white rock and scrubby thorn bushes. It was a land that demanded endurance. Eldon saw a large terebinth tree by the side of the road, its spreading branches offering a pool of deep shade. A cistern was nearby, a stone trough filled with green, stagnant water for animals. He pulled off the road. He needed to rest. His legs were trembling, the muscles twitching uncontrollably. He unbuckled the straps. He needed help to lower the crate, but there was no one to ask. He backed up to the tree trunk, lowered himself slowly until the crate touched the ground, and then slipped his arms out. He slumped against the tree. The bark was rough against his back, but the shade was cool. The smell of the tree, resinous and piney, reminded him of the glue. Terebinth, the tree of binding. He took a drink from his water skin. The water was warm and tasted of leather, but it was sweet. He ate 2 dried figs, chewing slowly, savouring the grit of the seeds. He watched the road. A rich merchant stopped his donkey nearby to adjust a saddlebag. The merchant wore a tunic of fine purple linen and rings on his fingers. He glanced at Eldon sitting in the dirt. The merchant's eyes slid over Eldon with total indifference. He didn't see a man. He saw scenery. He saw a piece of roadside debris. Eldon felt a flash of the old pride, the urge to open the crate, to show the merchant the gold, to say, "Look, I have more wealth in this box than you have in your purse." But he stayed still. He let the indifference wash over him. He realised that for the first time in his life, he was carrying a secret. He was a tabernacle. The glory was hidden on the inside, covered by rough wood and wool. Let them look past me. Eldon thought, it is better this way. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the wind rustling the dry leaves of the terebinth. He thought of Shadow. Was the cat sleeping under a tree like this? Was he hunting in the tall grass? Or was he back at the workshop, staring at the empty shelf? The guilt was still there, a small stone in his shoe that poked him with every step. But the road had a way of smoothing things out. The rhythm of walking was beginning to quiet his mind. "Get up, old man," he told himself. "The sun is moving." He struggled to his feet. Lifting the crate was harder this time. His muscles had cooled and stiffened. He groaned as he swung the weight onto his back. He buckled the straps, pulling them tight until they bit into the old bruises. He stepped back onto the road. The dust swirled around his ankles. The sun beat down. The noise of the pilgrimage surrounded him. But Eldon of Oakhaven walked with a new steadiness. He was no longer just a potter. He was a carrier. And the burden on his back, heavy as it was the only thing keeping him upright against the wind. One step. One step. One step. Jerusalem was still miles away, hidden behind the shimmering heat haze of the horizon. Jerusalem did not appear gradually. It did not emerge from the mist like a gentle suggestion. It announced itself like a shout of brass. Eldon crested the final ridge of Mount Scopus, gasping for breath, sweat stinging his eyes. He looked up, wiping the grime from his face with a trembling hand, and there it was, the city of gold. It sprawled across the hills like a lion sleeping in the sun. But it was a lion made of stone, massive, white, hewn limestone blocks that seemed to glow with an inner fire. The walls were impossibly high, growing out of the bedrock as if the mountain itself had decided to become a fortress. And above it all, floating like a cloud of gold and marble, was the temple. Eldon stopped dead in his tracks. The crowd of pilgrims flowing around him parted and rejoined like water around a stone. But Eldon couldn't move. He had seen the temple once before, as a boy, carried on his father's shoulders. But memory is a fading painting, reality was a blinding mirror. The sun struck the gold plates of the sanctuary, reflecting a light so pure and intense that Eldon had to shield his eyes. It looked less like a building built by human hands, and more like a piece of heaven that had crashed into the earth. "It is too much," he whispered. The crate on his back suddenly felt heavier, not with physical weight, but with the crushing gravity of inadequacy. How could he bring a box of glued-together mud into that? It was like bringing a candle to the sun. "Keep moving, old man. The gates close at sundown," a merchant leading a string of heavily laden camels shouted from behind him. The lead camel sneered, its lip curling, smelling the hesitation on him. Eldon lowered his head. He merged back into the stream. The descent into the Kidron Valley and the ascent to the gates was a blur of noise. The air here was different. In Oakhaven, the air smelled of thyme and sheep. Here, the air was a thick, complex soup of roasting meat, unwashed bodies, exotic spices, camel dung, and the sharp, metallic tang of copper coins changing hands. They approached the sheep gate. It was a cavernous maw in the wall, flanked by Roman guards who stood like statues of iron, their eyes scanning the crowd with bored menace. The noise was deafening. It was a physical assault. People were shouting in Aramaic, Greek, Latin, and a dozen dialects Eldon didn't recognise. Beggars sat in the shadows of the archway, crying out for alms, shaking tin cups. Eldon clutched the straps of his crate tighter. He pulled his elbows in. He felt small. He felt fragile. He was a dry leaf being blown into a furnace. He passed through the shadow of the arch. The stone walls were 20 feet thick, cooling the air instantly. Then he burst out into the city streets. If the outside was chaos, the inside was a labyrinth. The streets of Jerusalem were narrow, paved with slick, polished flagstones that had been smoothed by millions of sandals over centuries. The buildings rose up on either side, 3, 4 stories high, blocking out the sky, turning the alleys into canyons of stone. Eldon was swept along. He didn't know where he was going. He simply followed the current. He passed a bazaar. Here, the wealth of the world was spilled out on carpets. There were bolts of crimson silk from the east, shimmering like blood. There were mounds of yellow saffron and pyramids of frankincense. There were silver platters hammered so thin they looked like water. And then he passed the street of the potters. Eldon slowed down. Despite the jostling of the crowd, the stalls were lined with vessels. But these were not like the pots of Oakhaven. These were city pots. They were made of fine white clay, fired to a ringing hardness. They were painted with delicate black figures, Greek warriors, geometric borders, complex scenes of the harvest. They were perfect. He saw a water jar that looked similar in shape to his own. It was flawless. The glaze was a smooth, uninterrupted cream colour. The rim was perfectly circular. It sat on a shelf of cedar, looking arrogant and untouchable. Eldon felt a wave of nausea. He felt the crate on his back burning him. Inside that box was a disaster. A scarred, patched-up thing held together by tree sap and desperation. If he unpacked it here, these merchants would laugh. They would think he was selling rubble. "Why did I come?" the doubt whispered in his ear, louder than the market crowds. "I should have thrown it in the ravine. I should have stayed home and died in quiet obscurity." He wanted to turn around. He wanted to flee back to the hills where the air was clean and silence was free. But the crowd pushed him forward. There was no turning back. The current was flowing only one way, up, towards the Temple Mount. The sun began to dip below the high city walls. The narrow streets plunged into twilight rapidly. Lanterns were lit, casting long, jumping shadows against the limestone. Eldon needed a place to rest. He had no money for an inn, not with the prices of the festival season. He had spent his fortune on the glue. He found a small, recessed alcove near a public cistern, away from the main thoroughfare. It was a corner where two walls met, sheltered from the wind. He unbuckled the crate. His shoulders screamed with relief as the weight slid off. He sat down on the cold stone, pulling the crate between his legs, wrapping his arms around it. He took a drink of water. His hands were shaking again, not from age, but from the sheer vibration of the city. The ground seemed to hum. Across the alley, a group of pilgrims had set up a small fire. They were roasting a lamb. The smell of the fat dripping onto the coals was maddeningly delicious to Eldon's empty stomach, but he chewed on his dry barley bread, staring at the flames. "You look like you've walked from the ends of the earth. Grandfather." Eldon looked up. A young woman from the group was standing there. She held out a piece of meat on a flatbread. Her face was kind, illuminated by the firelight. Eldon hesitated. His pride flared for a second. He was not a beggar, but his hunger was stronger. "From Oakhaven," he croaked. "Just the hills." He took the bread. "Thank you, daughter." "What do you carry?" she asked, nodding at the crate. "It looks heavy. Is it tools? Grain?" Eldon looked at the rough wooden box. He thought of the teal shards. He thought of the gold veins. He thought of the halo. "No," Eldon said softly. "It is a story." The woman smiled, not understanding, but accepting the oddity of the old man. "May your story find a good listener," she said, and returned to her fire. May it find a good listener. Eldon ate the meat. It gave him strength. He leaned his head back against the rough Jerusalem stone. The wall behind him was likely built by Herod the Great. It was massive, imposing, and cold. Eldon patted the crate. "We are here," he whispered to the jar. "The city of stone. They have walls of rock, but we have veins of gold. Let us see which is stronger." He pulled his cloak tight. The city noise did not stop, it merely changed pitch. The shouting of merchants was replaced by the chanting of prayers and the barking of dogs. Eldon closed his eyes. He felt small, yes. But he also felt a strange sense of defiance. The city was built on power. His jar was built on brokenness. Tomorrow, the two would meet. He slept with one hand on the crate, dreaming of a mountain that crumbled into dust, only to be put back together by a hand made of light. The dawn in Jerusalem was not like the dawn in Oakhaven. In the hills, the sun rose over soil and trees, waking the birds. Here, the sun rose over stone and gold, waking the ambition of an empire. Eldon woke with a start. The noise of the city had changed from the low hum of sleep to the sharp, aggressive clatter of commerce. Carts were already rumbling over the flagstones. Water sellers were shouting. The day had begun without asking his permission. He sat up, his back protesting the hard stone of the alcove. He checked the crate immediately. It was still there, wedged between his legs, the ropes untouched. He stood up, brushing the city dust from his tunic. It was a futile gesture. The dust of Jerusalem was ancient and pervasive. It was the dust of prophets and kings, and it clung to everything. He drank the last of his water. He ate the last crust of his barley bread. "Today," he said to the crate, "today we climb." He swung the box onto his back. The familiar weight settled onto his bruised shoulders, heavy and demanding. It felt heavier this morning, perhaps because the destination was so close. He joined the flow of pilgrims moving towards the southern end of the Temple Mount. They were heading for the Hulda Gates, the great tunnels that led up from the city of David into the sacred precinct. To get there, they had to climb the southern steps. These were not ordinary stairs. They were cut into the living bedrock, wide and imposing, but they were uneven. Some steps were deep, requiring a long stride, others were shallow, forcing a stutter step. They were designed this way on purpose, the rabbi said, so that no one could run into the presence of God. One had to walk slowly, one had to look down, one had to bow. Eldon began the climb. Step, pause, heave, step. The crate pulled him backward. The sun, reflecting off the blinding white limestone of the retaining wall, beat into his eyes. He was surrounded by the faithful. There were men carrying lambs on their shoulders for the sacrifice. Fluffy, white creatures that bleated softly, unaware of their fate. There were women carrying wicker baskets of doves. There were rich men with servants carrying chests of coins. Eldon carried a wooden box that looked like a coffin for a dog. People gave him a wide berth. Not out of respect, but out of avoidance. He looked like a labourer, delivery man who had lost his way. He reached the top of the stairs. He entered the tunnel of the Hulda gates. The sunlight vanished. The air turned cool and echoed with the sound of 1,000 footsteps. There was a long stone throat swallowing them whole. Torches flickered on the walls, casting long, dancing shadows. Eldon felt a shiver of dread. This was the passage of transition. He was leaving the profane world of the market and entering the holy world of the silence. He emerged at the other end. He stepped out onto the Temple Mount. If the city had been overwhelming, the court of the Gentiles was paralysing. It was a sea of white marble. The floor was paved with stones so large they defied logic, polished until they reflected the sky. Colonnades of towering pillars, topped with capitals of cedar and gold, lined the perimeter. And in the centre, rising like a mountain of snow and fire, was the sanctuary itself. The holy place. Its gold plates were blinding. Smoke from the great altar of burnt offering rose in a thick, vertical column, smelling of cedar wood and roasted flesh. Eldon stopped. He forgot to breathe. He felt like a speck of dust on a king's table. The scale of the architecture was designed to crush human ego, and it was working. Move along. The temple guard shouted. Tapping the end of his spear on the pavement, Eldon shuffled forward. The noise here was a strange mix of the sacred and the chaotic. The chanting of the Levites, a deep, resonant drone of psalms, floated over the sharp bargaining of the money changers. Clink, clink, clink. 3 shekels for the dove, pure, unblemished. Exchange your Roman coin, Tyrian silver only. Eldon navigated through the bazaar of religion. He clutched his crate. He was not here to buy. He was not here to exchange. He was here to give. He looked for the place of the free will offerings. He saw a line forming near the treasury, under the shadow of the royal stoa. It was a line of people holding jars, bundles of cloth, and small chests. Eldon joined the end of the line. He set the crate down for a moment to relieve his shoulders. His hands were trembling. The man in front of him turned around. He was a merchant, dressed in a robe of fine blue linen with tassels of silk. He held a silver ewer, a pitcher for washing hands. It was exquisite. The silver was beaten thin, engraved with lilies. It shone in the sun. The merchant looked at Eldon's rough crate. He looked at Eldon's dusty, stained tunic. He wrinkled his nose slightly. "Are you delivering supplies to the kitchens, old man?" the merchant asked. Not unkindly, but with a tone of dismissal. Eldon looked at his box. He looked at the silver pitcher. "No," Eldon whispered. "An offering." The merchant raised an eyebrow. "In a packing crate? Is it grain? Fruit?" "It is. A vessel," Eldon said. The merchant nodded vaguely and turned back around. He had lost interest. A vessel in a crate was likely some crude pottery, heavy and thick, fit for the servants' quarters. Eldon felt a hot flush of shame creep up his neck. "I should go," he thought. "I should leave now. I can leave the box in a corner and run. They will find it later. I don't need to be seen." The imposter syndrome gripped his throat. Who was he to stand here? He was Eldon the Breaker, Eldon the Cat Chaser, Eldon the Destroyer. He was bringing a glued-together mistake to the house of perfection. But then he remembered the halo. He remembered the way the gold tooth on the rim had caught the light in his dark workshop. He remembered the feeling of the resin hardening under his fingers. "It is not a mistake," a quiet voice inside him argued. "It is a rescue." The line moved forward. Step by step, Eldon watched the interaction at the front. A priest sat at a table of acacia wood. He was young, efficient, and bored. He wore the white linen tunic of his office and a sash of embroidery. A woman presented a basket of woven flax. The priest inspected it. He nodded. A Levite scribe wrote something on a scroll. A servant took the basket away. Next, the merchant with the silver pitcher stepped up. He presented the object with a flourish. The sunlight dazzled off the silver. The priest's eyes widened slightly. He ran a finger over the engraving. He smiled. "A worthy gift," the priest said, his voice carrying over the noise. "It shall be placed in the treasury rooms." The merchant bowed low, glowing with pride. He walked away, his chin high. Now it was Eldon's turn. The space in front of the table felt miles wide. Eldon stepped forward. He dragged the crate with him. The priest looked down. He saw the old man. He saw the rough box. He saw the dust. His expression didn't change, but his eyes glazed over. He reached for his quill, ready to record a minor donation of grain or perhaps some tools. "What do you bring to the Lord?" the priest asked, his voice flat. Eldon's throat was dry as the desert. He couldn't speak. He fumbled with the knots of the rope. His fingers, stiff from the journey and the years, struggled with the rough hemp. I have brought a jar," Eldon stammered. "A jar," the priest repeated. He glanced at the line behind Eldon, checking the sun. "Open it, please." Eldon pulled at the knot. It was tight. He tugged. He grunted. The people behind him began to murmur. "Hurry up." "What is taking so long?" Eldon felt the sweat pouring down his back. Finally, the knot gave way. He threw back the lid of the crate. The smell of the terebinth resin, the smell of the forest wafted out, cutting through the smell of incense and roasting meat. Eldon reached in. He pulled aside the layers of wool from his sleeping mat. He found the neck. He gripped it. "It is for the water," Eldon said, his voice trembling. "For the washing." He lifted the jar out of the crate. He placed it on the table of acacia wood. The sun, which had been waiting for this moment, struck the object. The teal glaze, deep and oceanic, absorbed the light. The gold veins, jagged and violent, reflected the light. The halo on the rim flared like a star. For a moment, there was silence in the immediate vicinity. The sheer strangeness of the object stopped the conversation. It was beautiful, yes, but it was also terrifying. It looked like something that had survived a war. The priest stared at it. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He frowned. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing, looking not at the gold but at the lines beneath it. "It is broken," the priest said. The word hung in the air, heavy as a stone. Eldon stood there, his hands hanging by his sides, waiting for the judgment that he had feared for 3 days. The ascent was over. Now came the fall. The word broken did not fall like a stone, it fell like a gavel. The young priest did not shout. He did not recoil in horror. He simply stated the fact with the dry, bureaucratic detachment of a man who sorts fruit for a living. To him, the jar was not a tragedy, nor a triumph. It was simply a cull. Eldon felt the blood drain from his face and pooling somewhere in his feet. The noise of the temple courtyard, the chanting, the bleating, the coin clinking, seemed to recede into a dull, watery roar. "It is mended," Eldon stammered. He reached out a trembling hand to touch the gold seam on the belly of the jar. "It holds water. I have tested it. It is stronger now than it was before." The priest sighed. He set down his quill. He looked at Eldon with a mixture of pity and impatience. "Grandfather," the priest said, leaning forward over the table of acacia wood. "Look around you. Look at the pillars. Look at the altar. Everything here is tamim, whole, unblemished. That is the law. He gestured to the silver pitcher the merchant had just left. God demands the first fruits, the best of the flock, the spotless lamb. To bring a vessel that has been shattered, it is to bring a carcass. He reached out and tapped the jar with a manicured fingernail. Tink. The sound was duller than before. The resin had dampened the ring of the clay. "You have covered the cracks with gold," the priest continued, his voice lowering so as not to embarrass the old man too much. "It is skillful work, I grant you, but gold does not make it new. Underneath the metal, the clay is severed. It is ritually unclean. Earthenware that breaks cannot be purified. It must be destroyed. That is the Torah. It must be destroyed." The words echoed the very thoughts Eldon had battled in the dark of his workshop. But the gold... Eldon whispered, his voice cracking. "It is my wedding ring. It is my wife's ring. It is everything I have." The priest shook his head. "The cost to you does not change the nature of the object. Sacrifice must be pure, not just expensive." He pushed the jar slightly across the table, back towards Eldon. "I cannot accept it for the treasury. It cannot be used in the holy place. It would be an insult to the perfection of the sanctuary." The rejection was total. Eldon stood there. He felt a sensation of nakedness. The people in the line behind him were craning their necks to see what was happening. He heard whispers. Why did he bring a broken pot? Is he mad? Maybe he is a beggar trying to sell it. Eldon's hands hovered over the jar. A moment ago, it had been a map of grace. Now, under the cold light of the law, it looked exactly as the priest described, a ruin dressed up in costume jewellery. He felt foolish. He felt the crushing weight of his own arrogance. He had thought he could rewrite the rules of holiness with a bit of tree sap. I understand, Eldon whispered. He didn't argue. A potter does not argue with the kiln, and a pilgrim does not argue with the priest. He reached for the jar. It felt incredibly heavy now, dead weight. He lifted it. He turned away from the table. The walk back to his crate was the longest walk of his life. It was only 3 steps, but it felt like crossing a desert. He lowered the jar back into the wool-lined box. He closed the lid. He tied the ropes. He didn't look at the merchant behind him. He didn't look at the priest. He hoisted the crate onto his back. He walked away. He did not leave the Temple Mount. He couldn't bear to go back out into the city yet. He needed to hide. He moved toward the perimeter, away from the altar, away from the treasury, away from the gold and the white linen. He walked to the court of the Gentiles, the outer court, the place where the foreigners, the curious, and the outcasts gathered. It was a place of noise and dust, far from the silence of the Holy of Holies. He found a spot in the shadow of Solomon's portico, a massive colonnade of cedar and stone. He slumped down against the base of a pillar. He set the crate beside him. He didn't open it. He just leaned his head back against the cool stone and closed his eyes. He felt a deep, hollow ache in his chest. It wasn't the sharp pain of the break, it was the dull, throbbing pain of uselessness. He had walked 3 days. He had sacrificed his rings. He had driven away his only companion. And for what? To be told that broken things belong in the trash. "You were right, Shadow," he whispered to the memory of the cat. "I should have let you stay. I chose the clay, and the clay was rejected." He sat there for a long time. The sun moved across the sky, shifting the shadows of the pillars. The crowds thinned as the heat of the day intensified. Thirst began to gnaw at him. He reached for his water skin. It was flat, empty. He looked at the crate. The jar inside was empty too. But there was a public cistern nearby, a fountain where pilgrims could draw water. Eldon looked at the crate with a mixture of resentment and pity. "You are not holy," he muttered to the box. "But you can still hold water. That is all you are now." A bucket. He untied the ropes. He opened the lid. He lifted the jar out. In the shadows of the portico, away from the direct glare of the sun, the jar looked different. The teal glaze was dark, almost black. The gold veins glimmered faintly, like dying embers. Eldon stood up. He carried the jar to the fountain. It was a simple stone basin fed by an aqueduct. A few people were there, a Roman soldier washing his face, a woman with a crying baby, a lame man waiting for alms. No priest, no perfection. Eldon dipped the jar into the basin. Glug, glug, glug. The sound of the water entering the vessel was deep and musical. It filled the belly. It rose up the neck. Eldon lifted it out. It was heavy now, full of living water. He checked the seams. Not a single drop leaked. The gold held. The resin held. The integrity of the mending was absolute. "You hold water," Eldon whispered, running his thumb over a gold scar on the wet surface. "Even if they say you are dead." He took a long drink from the rim, the haloed rim that he'd smoothed with his own thumb. The water was cool and sweet. He lowered the jar. "Excuse me." A voice spoke from behind him. It was a quiet voice, resonant and calm, cutting through the ambient noise of the courtyard. Eldon turned around. Standing there was a man. He was not a young priest. He was an older man, dressed in a simple robe of undyed wool, but there was a dignity in his bearing that made him seem taller than he was. He had a beard that was grey, but his eyes were sharp and clear. He was looking at the jar. "I'm thirsty," the man said, "and I have no vessel. Would you share?" Eldon hesitated. He looked at the man's hands. They were rough, calloused, hands that had worked. "It is a broken pot, my lord," Eldon warned, repeating the priest's judgment. "It is not clean," the man smiled. It was a smile that seemed to understand the entire history of the world in a single second. "I did not ask if it was clean," the man said softly. "I asked if you would share." Eldon lifted the jar, and the story began to turn. Eldon lifted the jar. The muscles in his arms trembled, not from the weight of the water, which was substantial, but from the weight of the moment. He was offering a drink to a stranger from a vessel that had been declared dead by the authorities of God. It felt like a transgression. It felt like passing a counterfeit coin. He tilted the rim, the golden halo, towards the stranger's lips. The man did not flinch. He did not check the seal for purity marks. He cupped his rough, calloused hands beneath the jar to catch any drips, a gesture of instinctive conservation that marked him as a man of the desert. He drank. He drank deeply, the water running over his beard, splashing onto his woolen robe. He drank as if the water were not just hydration, but a gift he intended to honour by receiving fully. When he finished a citizen, he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and let out a satisfied sigh. "The water is sweet," the stranger said. His voice was like the sound of grinding grain, low, rhythmic and sustaining. "It tastes of the deep earth." "It is from the common cistern," Eldon muttered, lowering the jar to his knee. "Nothing special." "The water takes the shape of the vessel," the stranger corrected gently, "and the vessel tells a story to the water." He reached out a hand. It was a hand etched with the history of labour, fingers thickened by work, palms mapped with the callus of wood or stone. He touched the side of the jar. His finger traced the jagged line of the gold seam running down the belly. He didn't recoil from the scar. He lingered on it. "This is not a potter's mark," the man said. He looked up at Eldon, his eyes dark and piercing. "This is a wound." Eldon looked down at his feet, at the dusty flagstones of the portico. "It was broken," he confessed. "By my own anger. By my own pride. I tried to save it. With gold?" The stranger leaned closer, inspecting the resin. "This is not gold leaf. This is solid metal. Heavy. Pure." "My wedding ring," Eldon whispered. The shame burned in his chest again. "And my wife's ring. I ground them into dust. I thought if I paid enough, if I made it beautiful enough, the priest would not see the crack." He laughed, a dry, bitter sound. "I was a fool. They saw only the crack. They told me it was unclean. They told me to destroy it." The stranger ran his hand over the rim, feeling the solid gold wedge, the halo that filled the gap. "The priests are guardians of the boundary," the stranger said, his tone devoid of judgment but full of knowing. "They are trained to separate the holy from the profane, the whole from the broken. That is their burden. But it is not the only way to see." He took the jar from Eldon's hands. Eldon started to protest. "It is heavy, my lord." But the man lifted it with an easy strength. He held it up, not towards the shadows, but towards a shaft of sunlight cutting through the columns of Solomon's portico. "Look," the stranger commanded. Eldon looked, held in the stranger's hands. The jar did not look rejected. The sunlight struck the teal glaze, and the deep blue seemed to swirl like a living ocean. But it was the gold that captivated the eye. The veins of metal didn't block the light, they conducted it. The jar looked like a world that was being held together by lightning. "You see a failed pot," the stranger said softly. "You see a waste of gold." He turned the jar so the gold seam faced Eldon. "I see a vessel that has survived death. I see a vessel that knows what it means to be shattered, and yet refuses to stop holding water. The unblemished jars in the treasury. They have never been tested. They are innocent. But this..." He tapped the gold scar. Thud. It was a solid, resonant sound. "This vessel has character. It has been to the darkness and returned." Eldon felt a strange tightness in his throat. No one had ever spoken of his work like this. "But it is useless here," Eldon said. "The temple has no place for it." "The temple has many rooms," the stranger replied, "and not all of them are for the storing of silver." He stood up. He adjusted his robe. He held the jar comfortably in the crook of his arm, as a shepherd holds a lamb. "Come with me," he said. "Where?" Eldon asked, scrambling to his feet, grabbing his empty crate. "To the trash heap? The Valley of Hinnom?" The stranger smiled again, and this time the smile reached his eyes, crinkling the corners. "No, Eldon of Oakhaven. We are going to the court of the women, to the treasury of the offering." "But they sent me away from there," Eldon protested, fear spiking in his chest. The young priest knows the law of the altar," the stranger interrupted. "But I know the law of the heart. Come." He turned and began to walk. He didn't walk with the hurried pace of the Jerusalem crowds. He walked with a slow, deliberate rhythm. The crowd seemed to part for him naturally, not out of fear, but out of an unconscious recognition of his presence. Eldon followed, clutching his empty wooden box to his chest like a shield. They left the shadow of the portico. They crossed the sun-drenched expanse of the Court of the Gentiles. They approached the beautiful gate. Here, the crowd was thicker. The lame and the blind sat on the steps, calling out. As the stranger passed, he didn't stop to heal them, but he touched a shoulder here, nodded to a face there. He acknowledged them. They passed the guards. The stranger nodded to the captain of the watch, and the captain nodded back, not as a superior to a subordinate, but as a man acknowledging an elder. Who is this man? Eldon wondered. He wears no ephod. He wears no phylacteries. Yet he walks through the house of God as if it were his own living room. They entered the court of the women. This was a busy place. It was here that the 13 trumpet-shaped chests stood for the collecting of offerings. It was here that the widows and the poor came. The stranger did not go to the chests. He did not go to the side rooms where the wood and oil were stored. He walked to the centre of the court, near the great steps that led up to the Nicanor gate. There stood a simple stone bench. It was placed directly under the path of the sun. Next to the bench was a large communal basin for washing, not for the priests, but for the dusty, weary pilgrims who'd just arrived. The basin was old. Its rim was chipped. It was dry. The stranger placed the teal jar on the stone bench next to the dry basin. He positioned it carefully. He turned it so that the main scar, the river of gold formed from Eldon's wedding ring, was facing outward. "This," the stranger said, placing his hand on the jar's shoulder. "This shall be its place." Eldon stared. "Here, in the open, anyone can touch it. A child could knock it over." "Yes," the stranger agreed. "It will be touched. It will be handled." It will be used. He looked at Eldon. The vessels inside the holy place are seen only by the priests, and only in the dark light of the menorah. They are holy, but they are lonely. He gestured to the crowds of pilgrims flowing past, the dusty, the thirsty, the tired. But this jar will stand here in the sun. It will hold water for the mother who has walked from Galilee. It will wash the feet of the old man who can barely climb the stairs. It will serve the broken. The stranger leaned in close, his voice dropping to a whisper that vibrated in Eldon's chest. And when they drink from it, Eldon, they will see the scars, they will see the gold, and they will know that if a pot can be healed, perhaps they can be too. Eldon looked at the jar. It sat on the bench, humble and accessible. A ray of afternoon sun caught the halo on the rim, and for a second it flashed with a brilliance that rivaled the great golden vine on the sanctuary doors. "It is an offering," Eldon whispered, tears finally spilling onto his dusty cheeks. "It is truly an offering." "It is the best offering," the stranger said. "For it offers hope." The stranger stepped back. He dusted his hands on his robe. "I must go," he said. "My father's business has many hours." "Wait," Eldon called out. "Who are you? Are you a master of the treasury?" The stranger paused. He looked back over his shoulder. The sunlight framed his silhouette, making him look ordinary and infinite at the same time. "I am a carpenter," he said simply. "I know how to build, and I know how to fix." He turned and melted into the crowd, disappearing among the pilgrims as if he'd never been there. Eldon stood alone in the middle of the court. He looked at the jar. A young girl, dusty and tired, approached the bench. She looked at the strange teal vessel with the gold lines. She reached out a hesitant hand. "Is there water?" she asked. Eldon smiled. It was the first time he had smiled in weeks. "Yes." "Daughter," he said. "Drink. It is broken for you." The girl was small, her tunic dusted with the white chalk of the Galilee roads. She held the jar with both hands, her fingers small and brown against the deep teal glaze. Eldon watched her. He felt a protective instinct rise in his chest, not the fearful guarding he'd felt in the workshop, but a gentle, guiding impulse. "It is heavy," Eldon cautioned softly. "Let me help." He reached out and placed a hand under the base, taking the weight. He tilted the vessel. Water flowed over the golden rim, the halo. It cascaded into the girl's cupped hands. She drank greedily, splashing her face, the cool liquid cutting through the heat and grime of the journey. When she finished, she didn't turn away immediately. She looked at the jar. Her eyes, wide and dark, traced the jagged line of gold that ran from the lip down to the belly. "It is broken," she said, wiping her wet chin. Eldon braced himself for the rejection. He waited for the snare, for the echo of the young priest's voice. But the girl smiled. She reached out a finger and touched the raised seam of the wedding ring gold. "It is like my grandfather's leg," she said simply. "He fell from the roof. The healer set the bone. Now he walks with a limp. But the bone is stronger there than anywhere else." She looked up at Eldon. "It is a brave jar," she whispered. Eldon felt a lump form in his throat, large and painful. A brave jar. "Yes," Eldon managed to say. "It is brave." The girl ran back to her family, shouting that she had found water. Eldon stood by the bench. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western hills, entering that magical hour the painters called the golden time, when the light loses its harsh midday glare and becomes thick, syrupy, and warm. And then, the physics of the afternoon took over. The sun dropped low enough to slip beneath the roofline of the portico. A single, focused beam of light shot across the court of the women. It bypassed the marble pillars. It bypassed the bronze gates. It struck the jar. It happened in silence, but the visual impact was as loud as a trumpet blast. The jar did not just reflect the light, it seemed to seize it. The teal glaze, dark and glossy, absorbed the sun, glowing with a deep inner luminescence like a heated gemstone. But the gold, The gold was different. The intricate web of fractures, the map of scars that Eldon had painstakingly glued together, caught the fire of the sun, because the seams were raised slightly above the surface of the clay, and because the gold was polished to a mirror finish. They acted like 1,000 tiny mirrors. They projected. Eldon gasped. He stepped back. On the pale limestone wall behind the bench, a pattern of light appeared. It was not a shapeless glare. It was a complex, shimmering network of lines. The river seam cast a long, jagged streak of brilliance. The vine seams cast twisting, organic shapes of light. The halo on the rim cast a perfect, curved arch. It looked as if someone was drawing on the wall with fire. The pattern rippled and danced as the water inside the jar settled, creating a caustic effect that made the light seem alive. It looked like a tree made of lightning. It looked like a map of veins carrying liquid sun. "Look at that," a voice murmured nearby. A woman stopped. She was carrying a basket of doves, her face lined with worry. She stared at the jar, then at the wall. "What is it?" another pilgrim asked, stopping beside her. "It is the jar," the woman said. "See, the light comes from the cracks." A small crowd began to gather. These were not the wealthy merchants from the inner courts. These were the people of the outer circle, the tired, the dusty, the ones waiting for a miracle that hadn't come. They drew closer. They didn't look at the perfect silver vessels being carried past by the Levites. They looked at the teal jar with the scars. An old man, leaning heavily on a crutch, hobbled forward. He stared at the gold seam. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the resin. "It was shattered," the old man mumbled, his eyes tearing up. "You can see where the pieces were apart, and now they're holding together." He looked at his own twisted leg, then back at the jar. He stood up a little straighter. "If the clay can hold," he whispered, "maybe I can too." Eldon watched from the side, his back pressed against a pillar. He felt like an intruder at his own miracle. He realised now why the stranger, the Carpenter, had placed it here. In the treasury, inside the dark rooms, the jar would have been hidden. Its scars would have been seen as defects in the gloom. But out here, in the sun, the scars were the source of the glory. The floor was the lens. Water. Is there water? More people came. They were thirsty, yes, but they were also hungry for what the jar represented. Eldon stepped forward. He became the servant of the vessel. He lifted the jar for a mother with a nursing infant. He tilted it for a labourer whose hands were grey with stone dust. He held it steady for a blind man who found the rim by feeling the heat of the gold halo. Every time he tipped the jar, the light on the wall danced. Every time he poured, the gold flashed. "What is this vessel?" a man asked after drinking. "I've never seen such a thing. Is it Roman? Is it Greek?" Eldon looked at the man. He looked at the crowd. He thought of Oakhaven. He thought of the storm. He thought of the cat shivering on the roof. He thought of the file grinding his wedding ring into dust. "It is not Roman," Eldon said softly. "It is a Kintsugi. It is the art of the mended." "Who made it?" Eldon paused. He looked at his hands, the hands that had broken it in anger, and the hands that had fixed it in repentance. "A foolish old man made it," Eldon said, "but a carpenter placed it here." The afternoon wore on. The sun sank lower, turning the light from gold to a deep, bruising violet. The crowd thinned as the evening sacrifices began. But the jar was empty. It had given everything. Every drop of water Eldon had carried from the cistern was gone, dispersed into the bodies of 100 strangers. Eldon sat on the bench beside the empty vessel. He felt a profound exhaustion, but it was a sweet exhaustion, the kind that comes after a harvest. The hollow ache in his chest was gone. It had been filled by the look in the eyes of the lame man, the smile of the little girl. He looked at the jar. It was dull now, in the twilight. The light show was over. Without the sun, it was just a glued-together pot again. But Eldon knew the truth now. The glory wasn't in the pot. The The glory was in the interaction between the brokenness and the light. He reached out and stroked the rim, the halo where Sarah's ring now lived. "You did well," he whispered to the clay. "You did better than perfect." He felt a sudden, deep longing for home. The temple was magnificent, yes, but his work here was done. The offering had been accepted, not by the priests, but by the people. He thought of the empty workshop. He thought of the open door. "Shadow," he murmured. The guilt about the cat was no longer a sharp knife. It was a dull ache. But seeing the mercy the jar had received gave him a sliver of hope. If a pot could be forgiven for breaking, could a man be forgiven for anger? He stood up. He picked up the jar. It was light now, air-filled. He placed it back in the wooden crate. He tucked the wool around it. He would not leave it here. The carpenter had said it would be used, and it had been. But Eldon realised he could not leave it on the bench overnight. It might be stolen, or broken again by a careless cleaner. And besides, he had a new thought. A thought that was growing in his mind like a seed in warm soil. The jar didn't belong to the temple. It belonged to the thirsty. And there were thirsty people in Oakhaven too. He strapped the crate to his back. He walked toward the gates. He was leaving Jerusalem. He was going back down the mountain. He was going home to find the one thing he had left broken. The descent from Jerusalem is a deception of physics. Your legs move faster, pulled by gravity, but your heart often lags behind, tethered to the glory you are leaving. For Eldon, however, the descent was a liberation. He walked out of the sheep gate just as the sun was touching the western horizon. The great bronze doors were being pushed shut by the guards, grumbling about the end of their shift. The city was locking itself in against the night, hoarding its gold and its incense. Eldon walked out into the cool open air of the Kidron Valley. The crate on his back thumped softly against his spine with every step. Thump, thump. It was a familiar rhythm now, like a second heartbeat. But the quality of the weight had changed. 3 days ago, the crate had felt like a coffin. It had carried a dead dream, a source of anxiety and shame. He had walked terrified that someone would ask what was inside. Now, the crate felt like a tabernacle. It carried a witness. "We're going home," Eldon whispered to the strap across his chest. The road was emptier now. Most pilgrims were still in the city for the duration of the festival. Only the poor, the farmers who couldn't afford lodgings, and the restless were on the road this late. Eldon walked with a stride that surprised him. His old legs, which had burned and trembled on the ascent, now felt loose and capable. It was the strength of a man who has nothing left to prove. He bypassed the Mount of Olives. He walked through the Ark Valley, where the ancient tombs of the prophets stood silent in the rock face. He did not stop until he was well past the city limits, out in the wild Judean hills where the air smelled of sage and cooling limestone. He found a small overhang of rock near the road, a shepherd's shelter. He unbuckled the crate and set it down gently. He gathered a few dry sticks and lit a small fire. He had no food left. He had given his last crust to a beggar at the gate, but he wasn't hungry. He was filled with a strange, vibrating energy. He opened the crate. He lifted the jar out and set it by the fire. The flames danced in the teal glaze. The gold seams glittered. In the firelight, the jar looked less like a relic of the temple and more like a companion. It sat there, sturdy and scarred, looking as tired and triumphant as Eldon felt. "You were rejected by the priest," Eldon said to the jar, poking the fire with a stick, "and you were embraced by the carpenter. That is a good trade, I think." He ran his finger over the halo on the rim. He thought about the girl who had drunk from it. He thought about the lame man who had touched the scar. He realised that if he'd left the jar in the treasury, it would have been placed on a high shelf, dusted once a month by a Levite, and seen by no one. It would have been holy, but it would have been dead. By being rejected, it had been set free. "And what about me?" Eldon asked the silence. He looked at his own hands. They were empty of gold rings. They were rough. They were stained with resin. I am rejected too, he mused. I am not a master potter. I'm just a mender. The thought made him smile. Just a mender. It was a good title. It was better than master. A master demands perfection. A mender serves the broken. He lay down on the hard ground, pulling his cloak tight. He slept deeply, without dreams of drowning or falling. He slept the sleep of a man who has discharged his duty. The second day. The next morning, the road turned upward again, leading back into the high country of Oakhaven. The landscape changed. The barren white rock of Judea gave way to the softer, greener hills of his home. He began to see familiar trees, the twisty oaks, the silvery olives. He saw the terraces where his neighbours grew their grapes. With every mile, the euphoria of the temple began to fade, replaced by a new anxiety. It was the anxiety of the return. When you leave a place, you freeze it in your memory, but when you return, you have to face the consequences of how you left it. Eldon remembered the open door. He remembered the bowl of water. He remembered the silence. Shadow. The name echoed in his mind with the rhythm of his walking. What if he didn't come back? What if the foxes got him? What if he is lying dead in the woodshed? The closer he got to Oakhaven, the faster he walked. The crate on his back bounced. He passed the village well. A group of women were drawing water. They looked up as he passed. "Eldon," one of them called out. "You are back early. Did you see the high priest?" Eldon waved a hand but didn't stop. "I saw..." "Enough," he called back. He didn't want to talk. He didn't want to explain why he still had the crate. He needed to get to the workshop. He turned up the narrow lane that led to his house. The sun was setting again, casting long shadows across the path. The cicadas were starting their evening chorus, a high, buzzing electrical sound that signalled the end of the heat. He saw the roof of his house. He saw the olive tree. He saw the door. He stopped at the gate. His heart was hammering in his chest, harder than it had on the southern steps of the temple. The door was still ajar. The heavy riverstone he had used to prop it open was still there. That was a bad sign. If the cat had gone in and out, or if the wind had blown hard, the door might have moved. But it looked frozen, exactly as he had left it. Portrait of abandonment. Eldon walked across the courtyard. The mud had dried completely now, turning into a hard, cracked puzzle of earth. He approached the threshold. "Shadow," he whispered. Silence. He stepped inside. The workshop was dim. The air was stale, smelling of old dust and the faint, lingering scent of the pine resin. It was the smell of a place where time had stopped. Eldon unbuckled the crate and let it slide to the floor with a heavy thud. He didn't care about the jar right now. He walked to the corner. Empty. He checked under the workbench. Empty. He looked up at the rafters. Empty. He went to the bowl of water he had left near the door. He knelt down. The water was gone. The bowl was dry. Eldon's heart leapt. He drank it. But then he looked closer. There were no wet paw prints. There were no splashes. The dust in the bottom of the bowl was uniform. It hadn't been drunk. It had evaporated. The dry air of 3 days had simply stolen the offering. Eldon sat back on his heels. The hope that had fled for a second died, leaving a cold ash in his stomach. "He is gone," Eldon said aloud. The walls of the workshop threw the words back at him, flat and indifferent. He had mended the pot. He had found peace with God. He had served the pilgrims. But he had not fixed the one thing that truly mattered in his daily life. He felt the weight of his old age settle on him like a lead blanket. The house felt too big. The silence felt too loud. He stood up slowly. He needed to light the lamp. He needed to unpack the jar. He needed to continue living. He walked to the shelf where the oil lamp sat. As he reached for the flint, he heard a sound. It was not a meow. It was not a scratch. It was a soft, rhythmic rasp. Scritch, scratch. Scritch, scratch. It was coming from the back of the room, from the kiln. The kiln had been cold for days. The door was bricked up loosely, just a few stones stacked to keep rodents out of the firebox. Eldon froze. He held his breath. Scritch, scratch. It was the sound of something sharp moving against stone. Eldon grabbed the unlit lamp. He moved towards the kiln, his feet making no sound on the floor. He reached the brick wall of the oven. The sound was coming from inside the firebox, the chamber where the wood was burned to heat the clay. It was a dark, sooty cave, a place of ash. Eldon crouched down. He struck the flint. The spark caught the wick. The flame jumped up. He thrust the lamp into the opening of the firebox. 2 eyes reflected the light, green, wide, terrified. And then a low rumble began, not a growl, a purr. But it was a broken purr. It rattled in the creature's chest, wheezing and clicking. Eldon's heart stopped, then started again with a violent kick. Shadow, the grey shape in the ashes, moved. It didn't run. It dragged itself forward an inch. Eldon saw why the cat hadn't come to the door. He saw the leg. The firebox of a kiln is a place designed for violence. It is where wood screams as it turns into heat. It is a place of choking smoke and consuming red energy. It is the last place on earth one would expect to find a heartbeat. But there, amidst the grey dunes of cold ash, the heartbeat fluttered. Eldon reached his hand into the dark throat of the oven. "Come," he whispered. "It is over. The storm is gone." Shadow did not retreat. The cat was too weak to fight. He let out a low, miserable sound, a mewl that cracked in the middle and allowed Eldon to scoop him up. He was light, terrifyingly light, under the matted, soot-stained fur. The creature felt like a collection of dry twigs held together by fear. Eldon pulled him out into the workshop. The oil lamp on the floor cast a circle of yellow light. In that circle, the damage was revealed. Shadow's right hind leg, the leg he had kicked out in panic when he fell from the shelf, hung at a sickening angle. It was broken, not shattered, Maria. Perhaps, but snapped. The skin was unbroken, but the limb was useless, dragging like a dead weight. Eldon looked at the leg. Then he looked at the empty shelf where the jar had fallen. "You paid the price too," Eldon murmured. A wave of nausea hit him. He had spent 3 days mourning a pot. He had spent 3 days seeking redemption for a piece of ceramic. Meanwhile, this living, breathing soul had been dragging a broken bone through the dark, starving and in pain, hiding in the very place that symbolized fire. Eldon moved. He didn't move with the slow, arthritic stiffness of an old man. He moved with the focused urgency of a medic. He cleared the workbench. He swept away the dust. He took the soft woolen mat from the crate, the one that had cradled the jar on the journey, and laid it on the table. He placed Shadow gently on the wool. The cat hissed when his leg touched the fabric, his ears flattening, but he didn't bite. He looked at Eldon with eyes that were clouded with pain but desperate for relief. "I need water," Eldon said to himself. "Warm water." He rekindled the brazier. He filled a bowl. He waited, testing the temperature with his elbow until it was tepid, gentle enough for shock. He soaked a clean cloth. He began to wash the cat. He started at the head. He wiped away the soot from the ears. He cleaned the crust from the eyes. The water turned black instantly. Shadow trembled, his body vibrating against Eldon's hand. But as the warm water touched his skin, the trembling began to slow. The warmth was a memory of safety. Eldon worked his way down the spine, feeling the vertebrae sharply under his fingers. "I am sorry," Eldon whispered with every stroke. "I am sorry I chose the clay. I'm sorry I closed the door." He reached the broken leg. He stopped. This was not clay. He could not use resin. He could not use gold dust. He could not fire it in a kiln to make it hard. Flesh required a different kind of mending. He needed a splint. He looked around the workshop. He saw the pile of cedar kindling near the stove. He selected 2 small, straight sticks. He took his knife and shaved them smooth, rounding the end so they wouldn't dig into the skin. He needed binding. He looked at the crate again. He took the linen strips that he had used to wrap the jar's neck. He came back to the table. "This will hurt," Eldon told the cat. He spoke to him man to man. "But then it will be better." He placed his hands on the leg. Shadow growled, a low, warning rumble deep in his throat. "I know," Eldon said. He pulled the leg straight. "Yowl!" The cat shrieked and twisted, sinking his teeth into the fleshy part of Eldon's hand, right between the thumb and forefinger. Eldon didn't pull away. He didn't strike. He took the pain. He let the cat bite him. It was a fair exchange. He held the bone in place. He placed the cedar sticks on either side. He began to wrap the linen. He wrapped it tight, just as he had wrapped the jar to keep the resin seams from slipping. Over and under. Figure 8. Bind the wound. The words of the scripture came back to him, but this time they weren't abstract. They were tactile. Binding wasn't a magic spell. It was a mechanical act of support. It was lending your strength to something that had lost its own. He tied the final knot. He gently pried Shadow's jaws open to release his hand. The hand was bleeding. 4 deep puncture marks welled with red. Eldon looked at the bite. Then he looked at the splintered leg of the cat. "Now we are both marked," Eldon said softly. "We are blood brothers." He finished cleaning the cat. He dried the grey fur with a soft towel until it fluffed up, no longer matted with ash. Shadow looked small, ridiculous with his bandaged leg, but clean. Eldon carried him to the corner of the room, near the kiln wall where the heat still lingered. He made a nest out of the rest of the wool. He placed a bowl of fresh water and a small piece of the fish he had bought in the village on his way up. Shadow sniffed the fish. He ate, ravenously. Eldon sat on the floor, watching. He felt a profound sense of symmetry. In the crate lay a jar that had been broken and mended with gold. In the corner lay a cat that had been broken and mended with cedar and linen. One held water, the other held life. Eldon realised that the jar had been a rehearsal. The meticulous cleaning of the shards, the mixing of the resin, the patience of the holding. It was all training for this moment. God hadn't wanted him to learn how to fix pottery. God wanted him to learn how to fix living things. The kintsugi of the jar was beautiful, but it was static. The gold would never grow, the clay would never heal itself. But the cat, the bone would knit, the cells would bridge the gap. Life had its own resin, invisible and miraculous. "You are the living kintsugi," Eldon whispered to the cat. Shadow finished the fish. He licked his paws. He looked at Eldon. The fear was gone from his green eyes, replaced by a heavy, drugged exhaustion. The cat dragged himself forward, pulling his splintered leg. He didn't go to the wool nest. He crawled onto Eldon's lap. He circled once, awkwardly, and settled down. His head rested on Eldon's knee. And then, the sound began. Purr, purr, purr. It was stronger now. It wasn't the wheezing rattle of the firebox. It was a steady, rhythmic engine of contentment. It vibrated through Eldon's legs, into his stomach, and settled in his chest. Eldon reached out his hand, the hand with the bite marks, and stroked the grey fur. The workshop was silent, save for the purring. The jar in the crate was forgotten for the moment. The glory of the temple was 1,000,000 miles away. Here, in the dust of Oakhaven, a different kind of glory was filling the room. It was the glory of the second chance. Eldon closed his eyes. He felt the pain in his hand and the warmth of the cat. "Heals the broken-hearted," Eldon murmured, finally understanding the verse. It wasn't that God waved a hand and the pain vanished. It was that God gave you something to bind up. And in the binding of the other, your own heart was held together. He sat there for hours, afraid to move, afraid to disturb the sleep of the creature he had almost destroyed. He was the splint, and he was the patient, and the night wrapped around them like a dark, warm glaze, firing them into something new. Winter came early to Oakhaven that year. It came not with the violence of the storm that had broken the skylight, but with a quiet, persistent chill that settled into the limestone valleys. The morning mists clung to the olive groves until noon, and the smell of wood smoke became the permanent perfume of the village. In the potter's workshop, the fire was always lit now. Eldon sat on his stool near the warmth of the brazier. He was not working clay today. His hands, resting on his knees, were still. They were hands that had made their peace with idleness. On the woolen rug at his feet lay Shadow. The splint had come off a week ago. The bone had knit. The cat walked with a distinct limp, a hitch in his gait that rolled his hips slightly with every step, but he moved with a new, kingly confidence. He was no longer the skittish ghost of the rafters. He was the master of the floor. Eldon reached down and scratched the cat behind the ears. Shadow leaned into the touch, purring a low, resonant rumble that sounded like a small, well-oiled wheel turning. "We're a pair of old cripples," Eldon murmured fondly. "But we are warm." He looked towards the door. It was open, despite the chill. Outside, on a sturdy block of stone Eldon had dragged near the threshold, sat the jar. It had become a landmark. Eldon had named it the Vessel of the Unsent. It was for those who could not go to Jerusalem. It was for the shepherds who could not leave their flocks to make the pilgrimage. It was for the sick who could not climb the stairs. It was for the women who were too busy with harvest to travel. Every morning, Eldon filled it with fresh water from the spring. Every evening, it was empty. The villagers had stopped whispering about the crazy old man who glued trash together. They had started stopping by. At first, they came out of curiosity, to see the lightning jar that shimmered in the sun. Then, they came for the water. Finally, they came for the silence. Eldon watched through the open door as a neighbour approached. It was Miriam, the widow who lived down the lane. She was carrying a heavy basket of wool. She looked tired. Her shoulders slumped under the weight of her years. She stopped at the stone block. She set her basket down. She didn't drink immediately. She reached out and touched the jar. Her fingers traced the gold seam on the belly, the wedding ring of Eldon. She lingered there, closing her eyes for a moment. It was a liturgy without words. To touch the scar was to acknowledge one's own. To drink from the mended vessel was to accept that one could be broken and still be useful. She took the ladle Eldon had carved from olive wood. She drank. She sighed, wiping her mouth. She picked up her basket and walked on, but her step seemed lighter. Eldon smiled. He realised now that the temple was not a building in Jerusalem. The temple was wherever the broken met the light. "You were right," Eldon whispered to the memory of the carpenter. "It is better here." He stood up and walked to the door. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, violet shadows across the hills. The light hit the jar one last time. The halo on the rim, the piece made from Sarah's ring, flared up. It was a beacon. Eldon placed his hand on the rim. The gold was cold to the touch, but it felt alive. He thought of Sarah. He thought of the empty box under the floor where the rings used to be. He felt no regret, not a shred. The gold was not gone. It had just changed form. It had stopped being a possession and started being a bridge. "Come, Shadow," Eldon called. The cat limped over to the door, rubbing his flank against Eldon's leg. Eldon looked out at the road winding down into the valley. It was the same road he had walked in despair, the same road he had walked in hope. It was just a road of dust. But now, he knew that the dust was holy, because it was made of the same stuff as the jar, and the same stuff as him. He picked up the jar. It was time to bring it in for the night. Even the strongest vessel needs to rest. He carried it inside. He placed it on the low table right next to the cat's sleeping mat. He extinguished the oil lamp. The room plunged into darkness, save for the glow of the embers in the brazier. Eldon lay down on his pallet. shadow curled up against his chest, a warm, rhythmic weight. The workshop was silent. The wheel was still. The kiln was cold, but it was not empty. It was full. It was full of the presence of the mended things. Eldon closed his eyes. He listened to the wind outside and the purring inside. He felt the phantom pain in his old joints and the solid beat of his heart. He was Eldon of Oakhaven. He was a mender, and he was home. "Good night, my brave jar," he whispered. "Good night, my shadow." And the darkness was no longer a thing to be feared, but a blanket to be pulled up, warm and forgiving, over a long and weary day. And so, the wheel stops turning. The clay is finally at rest. Eldon and Shadow are sleeping now. The fire in the workshop has burned down to soft and grey ash, and the house is wrapped in the quiet comfort of the winter night. Their work is done. Their journey is complete. And you, my friend, you too have walked a long road. You've carried your own crates today. You have hidden your own cracks. Perhaps you have stood before the gates of perfection and felt like you didn't belong. Perhaps you have felt that your own scars made you unworthy of the light. But listen to the story of the jar. The crack is not the end. The crack is the beginning of the gold. You do not need to be perfect to be whole. You do not need to be unbroken to be beautiful. The very things you're trying to hide, your weariness, your mistakes, your fragile places, these are exactly where the grace gets in. So, let it go. Release the tension in your shoulders. Unclench your hands. You don't need to hold yourself together anymore. You're held by something stronger than resin, something more precious than gold. You are the vessel of the unsent. You are the resting place of the light. The darkness is gentle here. The door is closed. The storm has passed. Sleep now, traveller. Sleep in the safety of the mender's house. Good night.